Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us here this morning in Brussels. We're pleased to welcome you to FAIR 2's annual forum. It's the 5th annual forum now, focusing on issues in anti-doping. We've 2 sessions for you today, and we're focusing on this new shift, if you like, in anti-doping policy. Of course, all of you know about issues concerning elite athletes and doping problems. But there is a new trend toward considering what are the doping issues for the general public. Is doping really just a problem for elite sport or a problem of public health? How ought we to educate people in matters concerning doping substances? So we have a great lineup of speakers here today. From all around Europe, we're welcoming over 100 people, mainly around Europe, but also in broader parts of the world. And we hope that you'll join us in being interactive with your comments. You'll see from the program that you've lined up and registered for that we have Q&A sessions throughout the day. And we hope that you'll use the interactive social media possibilities to engage with us. And just to say that we will include full recordings of the day in the YouTube account of Europe Active. Before I go through to session 1 this morning, I'd like to introduce you to Cliff Collins. He's the Director of Programs at Europe Active, and he's led this program on behalf of Europe Active for a number of years now. We've had funding from the Erasmus Mundus program, and we're delighted they've continued with that. Cliff, tell us a little bit about today.
Thank you, Mike, and a warm welcome from Brussels for all of you tuning in around the world. Actually, the latest figure was that we're very close to 150 delegates coming today, which is really quite impressive. So thanks for joining in. Yes, indeed, Mike, it's been my privilege to run this project on behalf of our partners, and we have a very distinguished group of participants in here who've contributed to today's proceedings. There are 2 main sessions, which we have described as technical expert groups who've looked into various issues around the anti-doping policies and development of policy into practice for doping in recreational sport. And we are focused on recreational sport here. Now, the first session is going to be looking principally at the research findings of what has now become the largest survey of its kind anywhere in the world, we think, but certainly at the European level. And so we're going to look forward to those outcomes. And this afternoon, we're going to explore in a little bit more detail about how we may use this information and other practices out there in terms of helping to educate coaches, trainers, and instructors in recreational sport. So there's an awful lot to get through in this program, but I would like to just pay my respects and to thank very much the European Commission for their trusting us in this project. It's under the Erasmus Plus program, sport chapter. The Commission really has made a big commitment here over the years to supporting all kinds of people looking in this very, very important area of work. We're delighted to be able to report these findings today, and later this morning we'll be welcoming the Deputy Head of the Sport Unit indeed to come and address us and to tell us personally about the ongoing commitment of the European Commission in this area of work. So thank you everyone who's put in just an enormous shift to get this organised today. It's going to be very exciting. There's a lot to happen here. As Mike told you, it is a forum, so we'll be very, very interested in hearing from you about what is going on, what are your thoughts, what are your questions. We'll try and get these to the panelists, to the people who are presenting today. But if we fail to do that, we will note it and we'll try and follow up and make sure that we can get answers to your questions or points of view. So I wish you a very good day listening in to us. Sit back and enjoy the proceedings. Mike, thank you.
Allow me then to introduce the members of Technical Expert Group 1 who will present the research to you. We have Dr. Monika Frenger and Dr. Werner Pitsch from Saarland University in Germany. We have Professor Askves Christiansen from Aarhus University, Denmark, and we have Professor Andrea Chirico from Sapienza University of Rome. So they're going to address in their survey this key issue of prevalence. Who knows how many people are doing what kind of things in the doping arena? It's been the million-dollar question for a very long time. I'm aware that the composition of the audience is partly policymakers or public health officials or researchers, and their job today is to try to make easily understandable, a very complex methodology from social science, and I know that they're going to spend a few minutes working through that methodology with you and giving you a chance to see it too, before they present other parts of the research programme and the key headlights to you, after which we'll have responses from Dr. Olivier de Haan of the Netherlands Anti-Doping Authority. So, over to you.
Thank you, Mike, a lot for introducing us, and welcome from also Tech One. The whole group is standing here, and I want to give you some insights on the why of our study. So why should we do another anti-doping study? Some of you may wonder if it's necessary. Fair enough, so we wanted to. And that's why we did in the first step a systematical review, where we searched for research studies through keywords like recreational sports, performance-enhancing drugs, doping, prevalence, incidence, and so on. And in the next step of our analysis, we had to exclude, because of some criteria, some studies. That means we had no prevalence studies, no primary studies, or studies that didn't had doping as a main scope. From our first 963 hits, we go through a screening process, and then it ended up with 119 remaining studies. And that's the next step for filtering. We filtered now for studies that had as a scope doping in general and not a specific substance or substance group. And then we ended up with 3 relevant studies. We had a closer look to the studies, and there we had to say also these studies had some limitations. For example, either they have just a specific country or specific region included, only a relative narrow age group, or they focus more on methodological comparisons. And that's why we think it's important to have this broad study, what we did, because there is no study, as Cliff mentioned, that deals with the topic of prevalence estimation for different sports, for different countries in that big range that we did. And that's why we did it. And my colleague, Werner and Ask will now jump in to the methodology of the prevalence estimation, and after that, Andrea will give you more insights to the other topics. Thanks a lot.
So I will give you an introduction and an overview over the survey we ran on doping recreational sport in Europe. I started when you drive social scientific research into doping, you can run into problems. These problems are partly shown in this sketch here. You have response bias typically in comparison to other research which was driven with using other methods. You have different problems. There was some research which was done basing on public authorities' investigations or journalists' investigations. You gain very detailed knowledge about single cases, but you don't gain prevalence figures. The way the statistics is also not that good, as it is at least the lowest figures which can be estimated from the way the statistics, but you don't get a real good figure for the doping prevalence. And where the statistics focus on elite sport. And this is why we decided to drive one more social scientific survey study on doping in recreational sport. There weren't, you heard from my colleague Monika, not so many studies with that focus in an overall perspective before. And we tried to avoid this problem, this sampling bias, which you see now, but we try also to avoid the problems that people don't like answering to embarrassing questions in survey. You see, if I ask you, have you eaten cucumber in the last month, that will be no problem for you, I think. But if I ask you, did you cheat with your tax report last year, it will be a problem maybe for you to answer honestly to that questions. Social scientists have developed methods to deal with this problem of social desirability bias. It's already 70 years ago that the first methods have been developed for that. I told you social scientists have dealt with this problem of social desirability bias already for many years. And they developed so-called indirect questioning techniques. There are several indirect questioning techniques with their special advantages and disadvantages. We used for this survey the so-called randomized response technique. There are many reasons to use that in that setting. It would be too detailed to explain these reasons now. But what is it? What is this randomized response technique about? I don't want to explain it in mathematical terms. I want you to experience the randomized response technique. And I will show you a page which looks very similar to our survey page. You see, for a randomized response technique, before you are asked a question, you will get a special instruction. And the special instruction here is, if the last digit of your cell phone number is a 1, 2, or a 3, please answer the question on the right side. Otherwise, please answer the question on the left side. And you will soon see these two questions. But it's now the time to start the Slido survey, to have it available for everybody who wants to take part in it. Now you see the two questions here on the left side. In 2019, did you use over-the-counter medication to enhance your sporting performance? And on the right side, does every week have 7 days? And once again, look at the instruction. If the last digit of your cell phone number is a 1, 2, or a 3, please answer the question on the right side. Otherwise, please answer the question on the left side. And now it's time to start the Slido survey. Thank you. So please answer the question which you have selected according to your cell phone number, and we will hopefully see the figures here very soon. Okay. So once again, back to the RRT question, to the logic of the RRT question. You see there is one embarrassing question and one non-embarrassing question. The non-embarrassing question, does every week have 7 days, is for sure to be answered with yes. If you answer honestly, unless you tamper with the survey, you would answer yes. And the other question is the embarrassing question. Did you use over-the-counter medication, or we could also say freely available medication, non-prescription drugs, something like that, to enhance your sporting performance in 2019? And if I get it right, we already have some figures to enter into our Excel file. My colleague Monika will enter it, and she will present the results here very quickly. So it's important for you to see, I don't know which question you have answered. We don't know which questions you have answered, but we can calculate for the population you were drawn from, for the population of people who are interested in anti-doping. I assume that this is the relevant population for you. We can calculate the prevalence of this behavior, which may be a little bit embarrassing to you. So we didn't have the chance to enter the last figures, the very last figures here. Okay, so you see, we estimate a prevalence of using over-the-counter medication for performance enhancement of 28.57% among the population of anti-doping interested persons. And you see, I don't know who answered which question. I don't even know how you answered, if you individually answered yes or no, but that doesn't make any problem for us. That doesn't, we don't run into problems not knowing that. We can estimate the figure for the whole population. And now, let's go on with the
I would like to interrupt you here, Werner.
Okay, thank you.
So you clearly demonstrated to us how the RRT works. But despite the technical issues, it's also clear that you have to follow an instruction, and it can be perhaps slightly cognitive demanding to follow that instruction. Yeah. So in that regard, how good do you think the RRT is as a method compared to the traditional survey, where everybody understands what the question is about and what question to answer? So is there how do you see the trade-off here between the security of anonymity in the RRT and the easiness to respond in a traditional survey?
Yes, you're right. The RRT is cognitively demanding, and there are maybe problems from not correctly remembering your cell phone number. Things like that can occur. Okay. on the other hand, we know very well for the social desirability bias and social scientific research, and there has been a line of research over the last 70 years showing that RRT works much better than direct questioning techniques when it comes to embarrassing issues. And I think not every one of you would like to confess that you used over-the-counter medication to enhance your performance in sport. It's not illegal, but some people might think that it's at least illegitimate. And you would not like to confess that, and especially you would not like to confess that overtly. And that shelter from being seen as a doper, as a cheater, is worth using indirect questioning techniques even here. And we also have other research from elite sport where we definitely had to use the RRT. And so we can now compare also recreational sport doping, recreational sport to the known doping figures from elite sport.
So the reasoning here for the researchers is to balance that the pros with the RRT, with the anonymity, and that it's easier to respond to embarrassing questions, with the cons that it might be cognitively demanding, and you need to understand what the instructions are, and that can also be perhaps a little bit hard. So thank you, and please go on.
Okay, so now let's go on. Let's come to our survey, to the survey itself. The survey was driven with a focus on doping in 2019. That was due to the pandemic situation. And we couldn't ask for doping in the present season in the year 2020 for obvious reasons. This is why we focused on doping in 2019. The objective of the survey was to measure the doping prevalence in recreational sport in at least 5 European countries and in at least 8 different sports. We developed a questionnaire in English and translated it. We had it translated by professional translators and corrected by native speakers into 7 different languages. You see here in Danish, English, German, Greek, Italian, Norwegian, and Spanish. And as you see, Cyprus is also on the list. We didn't trap the survey only in 5 different European countries, but in 8 different European countries. So here's a brief overview over the main pages of the survey. At the first page, we asked for some personal details like the gender, like the birth cohort, the age. You can calculate the age from it, the country people live in, and so on. On the second page, people were asked to enter up to 4 different sports, 4 different recreational sports which they played. And also to indicate for which time they already played this sport and for the level of competition they had reached in 2019. And then we had several RRT questions for several embarrassing issues. Here you see once again the question for over-the-counter medication use for performance enhancement, which is not doping in a strong sense of the word, but by some people is seen as an illegitimate behavior. The survey phase ran through 3 months in 2021, okay? So we had, as typically we had many clicks onto the website, 17,000 clicks, but there are typically dropouts from people who say, okay, I'm interested in that, but I don't answer now. So we ended up with more than 8,000 records, and at first identified who are recreational athletes. We had 17,260 records from recreational athletes, and then drove some quality check on the data. And in the end, we had 17,403 records from different individuals, different recreational athletes with quality checked data. And additionally, you saw we asked recreational athletes for several sports. We asked people who had entered more than one sport for up to doping in 2 different sports, and that from that questions we got 9,500 records and also ran a quality check on these data, and we ended up with 9,431 records from these 8 European countries. And this is And I'm not ashamed to say that this is the largest survey which has been run on that topic ever. Okay, but you suppose me to present you the one number indicating the prevalence of doping in recreational sport. When it comes to that, you see social scientists sometimes have some problems. And I want to show you only two of the problems we have with presenting that one figure which people rely on in public discussions. And the first problem is that we deal with vague concepts. And the second problem is that we have partially unknown populations we deal with. Vague concepts, for instance, recreational sport. What is recreational sport? What is a recreational athlete? And there are different contexts where this term is used. You can have legal contexts, you have theoretical contexts, and you can have a social scientific context. And in a social scientific context, recreational athlete is anybody who defines himself as a recreational athlete, because it's defined in the communication within a population. What is recreational? What is an athlete? And in that sense, we have to rely on, as social scientists, we have to rely on the self-definition of our respondents. And the same holds for doping. Doping is a legal term which is defined by the WADA. Okay, that is relevant for elite sport, but is it relevant in recreational sport? We really don't know if respondents in recreational sport see this definition, or an intentional definition which we could develop in social sciences, if they see this definition as relevant to them. And this is why we also have to rely on the respondents' understanding of doping, which may but must not overlap with the other two definitions. So I can only say this is the type of challenge you cannot avoid when you do empirical social research. The other problem, there are techniques to deal with, the problem of unknown populations. So far we don't have a really good and detailed description of the population of recreational athletes in Europe, but we could estimate the population of recreational athletes in Europe from data from the Eurobarometer data and from Eurostat statistics, and we could describe the population in terms of gender, age, and country. But we don't know the population distribution, for instance, by sports or sport categories, which sports are done at which frequencies. We don't know the level of athletic success. We don't know the rate of club organized or individually organized sports, and so on. There are many dimensions we don't know. You can imagine our data were at least somewhat biased according to gender, age, and country, and we corrected for that bias by using appropriate statistical methods, by weighting our data according to the frequencies in the sample, to make our data usable, or our sample to make our data usable for the population in terms of gender, age, and country. We don't know anything about the other dimensions. We don't know if the data are really representative for the sample. We can never know. These are the limitations of the interpretations of our data. That should be said at first. And now let me come to the results. I think this is the thrilling moment now to most of you. So I will start with the results to the question you have already answered. And this was the question for using over-the-counter medication for performance enhancement. And what you see here, the green bar, the upper green bar, is the estimated rate of honest no answers to this question. And the red bar is the estimated rate of honest yes answers to the question. The white part in between indicates respondents who did not answer according to the instruction. And that may result from, on the one hand, they don't trust the instruction, they don't understand the instructions. Maybe people also don't really remember their cell phone number, or in this case, it was a randomly generated serial numbers. They handled this randomization device incorrectly, and that can lead to this insecurity in the data. But what you see here I don't see it very well from here. I have to go one step ahead. Okay, there are at least 10% of honest yes respondents to that question using over-the-counter medication to enhance sporting performance in 2019. 20% of respondents we don't know anything about. There will be only speculation if we try to think about their behavior. But we know, on the other hand, at least 70% who honestly said no to that question. Let me come to one more dimension of medication use in the context of sport. We also asked for the use of medication for other reasons than performance enhancement. And we gave some examples with the question. It was using painkillers, it was using mood enhancers, things like that. And you see here the prevalence, the red bar is even larger. There are more than 40% who honestly answered yes to that question, and we can only be sure for some 20% who we estimate are honest no responders to that question. That means maybe medication use in the context of sport is maybe more widespread than people often think. Okay, and now the really thrilling moment to everybody else around here in the studio, the figures on doping in recreational sport. And what you see now is a large green bar. There are 90%, more than 90% estimation of honest no responses. So doping in recreational sport, we can be confident that by maximum 10% can be dopers in recreational sport. And if we look at the honest yes estimate, it's 0.44%, less than 1%, less than 0.5% are honest yes responders to this question. Okay, let me go on with some more specific results before we can put this into more broader context maybe. These are first results on doping for different sexes. We calculated the data for female and male recreational athletes. And what you see here, it's what is already known from elite sport, that doping for females is much less prevalent than doping among male recreational athletes. The difference isn't that large. You see a maximum estimate of around 3%. You see the estimates. It's not a point estimate, which is extremely secure. It's an estimate. Okay, but you see the honest no responses, they differ by, okay, some 5%, I think. Okay. And let's compare that difference between females and males in doping to the usage of over-the-counter medication for performance enhancement. And there you see that using over-the-counter medication is not that different between the two sexes. So the bars of honest no responders are nearly equal, and the difference in honest yes responses is not that large that we could interpret very much into that.
Thanks, Werner. Just to wrap up the first part of this session. So if we put on the results here, we can see that there are virtually no recreational athletes that intentionally use prohibited drugs to enhance their performance in recreational sport. So that is sort of the overarching or the primary response to our survey question or our research question. The next thing is that we see that 1 in 10 respondents will use over-the-counter medication for performance enhancement when doing recreational sports. And that is about equally the same between men and women. And the results where we have perhaps the most surprising, or where people raise their eyebrows, is that more than 4 out of 10 respondents do use medications, some kind of medication, for other reasons than performance enhancement in sports. So these are sort of our 3 or 4 take-home messages from our survey until now. So let me just ask the final question for you, Werner, before we bring it on to our colleague Andrea. Given these results, would you say that since virtually no one uses doping in recreational sport, that we could now finish doing research on recreational athletes and doping? Is this the end of that?
No, I don't think so. I really don't think so, because we only started to analyze this large data set. And what we already found was this gender difference. And we will have the chance now with this large data set to look into more differences between different groups. For instance, between discipline groups, like between games and other sports where performance is measured in physical units, like track and field athletics or rowing, things like that. And maybe we'll find interesting differences with these limitations between different groups. So there's still a lot of work to be done, at least for that data set. And from that work, new questions will very, very likely arise.
Thank you. That's very reassuring as a researcher. We'll now give the word over to Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Is this working? Okay. Okay, so one of the main aim of the FAIR project was also to try to understand, evaluate, identify some predictors of doping vulnerability. So our first main objective was already described by my colleague of Tech 1, was the incidence, so the prevalence of doping in recreational sports. But a secondary aim is try to understand which are the factors that can predict this doping vulnerability. And within Tech 1, we decided to try to integrate the RRT questions, so the RRT methods, with some more traditional approaches and framework. So traditional approaches and framework normally in literature are used for elite athletes, and researchers and scholars try to evaluate, understand predictors of doping use, like conceptualize doping like unintentional use of substances to increase performance. And there are different socio-psychological theories, there are different approach, there are different data analysis methods, and all these are mainly used for elite athletes, and there are very few studies on recreational athlete, and there are very few studies like our studies that takes across 8 countries in Europe. Even though recently in literature, there is also a new mainstream that's tried also to shift this paradigm, is not trying to understand the predictors of doping use, but trying to evaluate factors or characteristics of the clean athlete. So more toward the understanding the pro-clean sports behavior. And these variables normally are related to values, so positive values, moral identity, something that also Werner said like the spirit of sports, so all the positive value of sports that should keep people clean from doping. So what we decided to do, in the same European survey where the RRT questions were being made, we also try to frame a survey using some questionnaire, trying to evaluate behavior, personal factors, and environmental factors. There are typically some variables linked to the socio-cognitive theory. How we did it? So we decided to analyze 4 different variables. We used a validated questionnaire that have been translated and back translated with professional translators. One of the first was a protective factor that is resisting to doping. So we asked a participant how would they feel confident in resist to dope even though there is a pressure to do it from others. And this was one first questionnaire, and it's a first variable. A second was a risk factor, that is a moral disengagement. There's a set of justification that people use to do some bad behavior, don't feel guilty. So moral justification, moral disengagement was our second variable that we measured in all our participants. A third one was the attitudes toward doping, so positive attitudes toward doping. That is the proximal indicators of doping use. And this is another very used variable, let's say. And then we integrate also with some clean athlete factors. There was a moral identity. So some positive values, and we asked our participants to rate themselves about these values, these positive values. So what we find in the first whole sample, so in all our countries and all participants, our model actually was very in line with the literature on elite athletes. So we find that, as you can see, the red arrow is a risk factor. So as you can see, moral disengagement, so using a set of moral justification will increase attitudes toward doping, while values and self-efficacy are working as a protective factors toward the use of doping. So this model was working. We have great results in terms of statistics. And as you can see, the thickness of the arrow will define the power, the effect size of that variable. And we still have that moral disengagement is one of the variables that is the strongest in terms of effect on the attitudes toward doping. But so far, this is nothing about integrating RRT, you will say, because this is just a normal model in a whole sample. So what we made is try to using the prevalence estimates from RRT questioning to try to do multi-group analysis. So we taking that data, we know there are some different incidences, some different prevalences, let's say, for example, in women and male, and we decided to run a multi-group analysis starting from this group. So basically what's new is that normally you do this multi-group analysis with some models, but you basically made this only of some theoretical idea. So that gender are not like gender differences or sports differences, and not with prevalence estimates like from RAT questioning. So what we made here is try to merge these two methods. So this was, for example, the data on female. You can see as a moral disengagement, still the tick hair off is strong effect on attitudes, but we don't have any effect of values, for example. While in male subsample, we have a close, very similar model to the whole sample. So what we really want to try to achieve is basically try to understand the predictors in the subsample using the RRT prevalence estimates, and this will work also as a concurrent validity, because we are saying that there are some significant difference between genders as we find difference in prevalence. So these two methods are try to follow a same pathway. So the future analysis we want to do with TEG1 is try to move on the same line using the RT incidence estimates and prevalence, try to see difference in groups, for example, different sports, let's say fitness or individual sports or group sports or different countries or cultures, and try to evaluate the same models in terms of how these variables are linked one each other. So just very quick take-home message. First things is a methodological issue. We try to integrate these two data analytical methods. The second one is we want to try to, with further analysis, try to improve the understanding of motives or social psychological aspect that guides recreational players to use doping or that prevent it, like the clean sports factors. And further analysis should also have new knowledge on different target group. So thank you so much for your attention. I hope that this was fine and was clear. So thank you, Mike. I think we have now question answer and also some interaction with you guys. So we wait you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you very much to the team also. We will be inviting Olivier de Haan to respond to what he's heard, and I believe he's online.
I'm here. Do you hear me?
Thank you very much, Olivier. So Oliver is with the Anti-Doping Authority of Netherlands. Please don't wait until the end of this session to put through your questions onto Slido. I'm told that we already have quite a nice queue building up there. And while this session is going on, we will be logging all those interventions on Slido and building them into a list of questions to put to our experts here. But let me first hand over to Olivier. How would you like to start your questions to the expert group?
Well, I would like to start with thanking them, because this is obviously a tremendous effort with a large number of participants, and it's making for very interesting results. But of course, also to some extra questions. I think the researchers already have discussed a few of those questions, rightly so. Yeah, I think my first question is, I think it's either to ask or Werner, if I can use first names. Does indeed the number that positively replied that they did use the doping substance in the whole group is 0.5% or thereabouts. Obviously, any user of bad substances, in my mind, is one too many. But we have to remain realistic. There are persons who are doing that. And it's not too bad result in my eyes. Wouldn't you agree?
So Olivier, you are the one from the anti-doping world. I am the social researcher. So my role is to provide these figures and to provide these figures with the best and the most reliable method. But I agree with you. If you think that the figure should not be too high, I agree. This figure is really not high. It's much lower than the figures we have from elite sport. We also had higher figures from some areas in former research from some areas in recreational sport like cycling in the USA. There were higher figures, but we have also to see the overall figure for all sport, for all the age groups, for both genders in these 8 European countries. It's not a threat, I think, to the anti-doping world. And it's not such a big threat to recreational sport. As you want to add something?
I might say 2 things. Well, if you've got bigger numbers, for example, in recreational cycling in the USA, did they use the same technique of survey? And if so, how could you start to think about why you've got bigger numbers there than here? But a second part of that might also be to say, well, is this number so low that because the dropouts from the first click were those people who decided, actually, why would I want to do this? Why would I want to tell these people that I've been doping? So could you expand a little bit on those 2 comments, either if you start and the rest of the team after?
I think I'm the person to answer these questions because I did that research in USA Cycling as well, and I used the same method, and we had the same problem with this first dropout after clicking onto the survey link to think, should I answer to these doping questions to these people? You see, both questions are answered, and these figures are in fact comparable. That's the point. So, but that points to the issue I raised after your last question, Ask. We have to look in detail into different groups, maybe different age groups, maybe different sport disciplines, maybe different levels of athletic success to understand the socio-economic drivers behind doping, in addition to the psychological drivers, which can help us to understand individual decisions.
And I think it's an important point that you emphasize this about how does the dropout rates look. And since it was the same type, the instruction technique was similar in the one done in US cycling, the results are comparable. But this, of course, does not mean that a lot of those who may be doper, when they see the questionnaire, think, nah, not for me. And this is the problem with this kind of research, that the people you are addressing and perhaps most interested in hearing from, they are not responding to that kind of survey. So even if we use this technique and we think that it's better than a traditional survey, we may very well still have an underestimation of the actual behavior of doping in recreational sport. That said, back to Olivier's question, I think our results emphasize that there's no need to raise a big red flag on the population of recreational athletes in Europe. There's absolutely no need to do that. So the question is whether there would be subpopulations, subcultures, where it would be more better to tailor your interventions or to target your specific interventions. That is what we have to find out from here.
Andrea.
So yes, and I think another interesting things about these results, also as Olivier highlighted, is that actually probably everybody was thinking that more people will use doping in that group, you know. And if I can just like put a little drive to psychological issues, one of the moral justifications says I use doping because I think that everybody does it, you know. And this is just a justification. So probably they are saying, yeah, you guys that use doping, that 0.4%, just you're thinking that everybody does it. So just to merge more or less the two theoretical issue, okay? So thank you.
That's quite important because you might say the perceptions of an elite sample could be wildly different from the perceptions of a recreational sport example. Well, Olivier, we often hear that doping in recreational sport is not the tip of the iceberg, it's the iceberg under the water. Well, it looks like that's a misperception. Did that surprise you?
No, No, it didn't really surprise me. I know there are a lot of recreational athletes who do it just for the pure fun of it. And of course, they're looking at their times and they're looking at their apps to see how fast they're running, or looking at the scores of their sports they're participating in. But I'm convinced that the vast majority does not want to use doping, does not even want to use extra medication. So in a sense, I'm not too surprised, but I'm happy that it is there, that these figures are there, that they are available. But I would like to ask, one more question on which we should not run ahead of ourselves and say, okay, it seems not to be a too big problem in Europe, and it's of course based on what was already discussed, the selection bias. So we will have a few more questions on that. There were 8 countries selected. So I was wondering, why were these particular 8 countries selected, and how were the coaches and trainers that were approached, how were they selected?
So can you remind us of the sample, Werner, before you give us the justification for it? What were the 8 countries?
The 8 countries were, I started in the north, Norway and Denmark. We had in Central Europe, Germany, and Western Europe, Great Britain, and in Southern Europe we had Spain, Italy, Greece, and Cyprus. Although I must confess, from Cyprus we didn't receive too many records, so we had to add these data to the Greek data. So in the end we have 7, more or less 7 national subsamples. Can you explain something about
So
strategy?
the sampling strategy was so the objective from the original research application was that we wanted to collect data from 5 European countries. So we expanded that to the 8, and Werner almost said it, that we wanted respondents from northern part of Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, and southern part of Europe. We are lacking data from Eastern Europe. That's clear enough. So we don't have that in our sample, and that is, of course, a weakness to that. That said, there is also, and we have to look further into this in our further, when we go deeper into the data, there's also a variance between how many respondents we got from each country. And that, of course, also may affect the results we get out. Even if we try to weigh the data, there were some significant differences between how many respondents we get from the different countries. And they were not run by coaches, as you said, Olivier. We ran the survey from social media. So we had student assistants running on platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc., to try to get the survey out with a link to respondents in club and communities that were available on Facebook, and from there have as many respondents as possible to the survey. So that's a limitation that we can talk about as well. How well did that work? That push on social media to get the data there. So it's social media driven and by snowball sampling and so on.
Okay, thanks for the explanation. And that makes it interesting, of course, because then you have a rather open ending. You mentioned the other study in American recreational cyclists, and I think those were the athletes who were approached there. They were all a member of USA Cycling. So then you have a rather closed group that you are trying to reach. And that makes it easier to say something about representation or potential selection bias. But of course, Europe is much bigger, so it is difficult. I understand that. You mentioned that these are real results, but that you continue to do the analysis. Can we also expect prevalence estimates for sports or groups of sports, or even between countries, or the age categories?
Yes, for sure you can. For sure you can. We focus on that at present. We will not be able to calculate estimates for individual sports, for different sports, but we will be able to calculate estimates for groups of sports. I already mentioned games, for instance, and CGS sports, as we name them, like track and field and rowing and cycling and so on. the figures are also high enough for aesthetic sports, unfortunately not high enough for combat sports. So we can calculate for these three groups of sports, we can calculate for different age groups, we already showed for different genders, and we already had a glimpse at differences between Northern, Central and Western and Southern Europe, and these are also very, very interesting figures. They will be presented in at least one academic paper, I hope, in the next year, and will for sure be presented at the next forum, at the next forum for anti-doping and recreational sport here in Brussels next year.
So it's not yet clear to me if you're not presenting the data against different social demographic factors other than gender, is because of the way you've anonymized the data, or is because of the lack of responses in particular sport groups? So can you say a little bit more about that, please?
This is a very technical issue. It's very the lack of responses in different sports groups, and we didn't have enough recreational athletes from combat sports to estimate valid figures from the RRT. The RRT needs extremely large samples because of the anonymization strategy. We gain the advantage of a reduced social desirability bias, but we run into the problems that we need extremely large samples. And here we have large samples for some subgroups. We will analyze as deep as possible in these social economic dimensions like sports and so on. But we also have to confess where we cannot go on because the figures would be too low and any estimation would run into problems, especially concerning the reliability of the results.
So that's a trade-off that's just built into the model then?
It's that, exactly.
Werner, ask, sorry.
Thanks, Mike. No, and I can just add to that as some of the viewers may have seen, that we had the white bar in the middle with the instruction non-compliance, and we can use that data as well to see how well the individual questions were understood by specific subgroups. So when we do go into the details, we can see whether a question, for instance, that we had included but not have presented results on people who use drugs for aesthetic reasons, that would be bodybuilders, for instance. But for now, we have to check whether the question that was passed on in the survey there was understood by the respondents, and the extent of the instruction non-compliance is a way to understand whether the question was acceptable, understood in an acceptable manner for the respondents. So we'll have to do those calculations for each of the individual subgroups we look into, where we also have a big enough population.
Right, so green and red you're confident in, the white you just can't say anything about.
Exactly.
Perfect, okay. Olivier, back to you.
Yes, well, that's an important topic I have on my list as well, the instruction for non-compliance. There was also a question asked on the slide on that. There is various percentage there between the different questions. On doping it's a rather small percentage. But for sport-induced medication for other reasons than performance enhancement, it's a much bigger percentage. Do the researchers have any idea how this, what could be the reasons for this large difference in the instruction on compliance percentage?
Okay, Olivier, there is a by principle answer, and this answer by principle is that we don't know anything about those who do not answer according to the instruction, and this is why that bar is simply white. We don't know anything about them. If we start to speculate, okay, and I dare to speculate a very little bit here, then instruction non-compliance can arise from self-protective behavior from people who do not dare to confess that they have done something embarrassing, maybe because they don't trust the instruction. If our doping estimate of less than 0.5% is at least somewhat correct, there are very, very few people who are in the situation, should I really answer yes, and who might really cheat with our survey in that point. But if you ask for using medication for some reasons in the context of sport, which is also sometimes seen illegitimate, I have also seen comments on forums which discuss that as you shouldn't use any medication in the context of sport. Then, if our estimation there with this more than 40% is at least somewhat correct, there are many more people who are in the situation to decide, shall I really answer yes to that embarrassing question? And given that, it's not that astonishing that instruction non-compliance is higher when the prevalence, the estimated prevalence of honest yes responses also is higher. Okay? But this is speculation.
Monika, can you say just a little bit more? Instruction non-compliance. That's a very technical term. Unpack that for the listeners.
Okay, that, like Werner said, there are all those people who in one part don't want to follow the instruction, maybe if they don't understand the instruction, or simply did something wrong, had the wrong number, did something wrong in this process, did the wrong number for the wrong question. That's just non-compliance because they don't follow exactly how RRT should go. And if I can add one more speculation on those part of this non-compliance answers, it also could be that the order of our RRT questions, because some of our respondents had 3 or 4 questions concerning doping or concerning medication, that they get a sort of tired in this survey, and because of that don't want to or don't do it right and follow until the end. So we have to check if the order has an influence also on this non-compliance factor. That's just also speculation. But as Werner said, there can be different things. Some questions can be more embarrassing than others. Some things can just be because of this process and they don't follow the instructions because they do something wrong. And that's interesting to check also for this non-compliance between different groups, because maybe some questions can be more embarrassing for the one group than for the other. That could be also an interesting research topic.
You happy with the answer, Olivier, or do you want to follow back?
Very happy with all the answers. And also, personally, I think it's what Monika just said. It's also a matter of the people maybe just didn't understand the question perfectly. Also, maybe because of the definitions that are used, and maybe people even from different countries or different backgrounds understand it differently. But in the end, you just don't know. But there's a rather more technical question as well. This is a very, it's an often applied example of randomized response technique. There are other techniques there as well. Did you consider any other possibilities of RRT, or is this just the best RRT possibility that there is available in your eyes?
That has to be balanced out. That always has to be balanced out. I talked about indirect questioning as a whole, and Olivier, you know that there are not only RRTs, but there are also other indirect questioning techniques, and you always have to balance out advantages and disadvantages of the different method. Yeah. For this research here, we decided to use the RRT with the detection of instruction non-compliance because this was not the first study which we have driven in doping, and not the first study which we have driven in doping in recreational sport. And in all these studies before, we had used that method, and therefore we thought we have a large number of other studies which we can directly compare to these results. And this was, from our perspective, the main advantage of the RRT, especially with this detection of of instruction non-compliance. Okay?
Okay. I have another question. I think it's for Andrea, Chirico. This is, for me, the first study that I can see a clear connection between the preference figures and the social psychological factors behind it. And I think that is also possible because of the large number of respondents here. Is that true? And could you perhaps give an estimate of the number of participants that are needed to be able to do this sort of analysis?
Thank you, Olivier, for the question. Yes, for sure, the number of participants are very important in this kind of analysis, because you're trying to merge items, factors, and regression together with group, so different group of people, and for each group you expect to have a number of participants that is proportionally related to the number of variables that you want to make interacting in the model. So to make this example clear, we had 4 different variables. So the 4 different factors. For each factors, we had like 7 or 8 items. So you're around 30 or 35 items, and normally what you have is 10 participants for each items at least to make running one analysis. So 300, 400 participants for each of them to make the multi-group analysis. 400 participants for each group. It's like the minimum that you can make to have, a good estimates. But overall, there is still, the problem, the limitation about how this representative for the population. We don't know the population, and other, some statistical and technical issues that are related to it. But yes, this is the first time that we made this, and I think the higher number of our survey helped out to make this happen somehow.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and then there's one invitation. This is a lot of work, obviously. There was one more concern in my eyes because of the pandemic. Obviously, we did the survey in 2021. The questions were over 2019, so that's a long time ago for the people for also the respondents. Is there any repeat of the study planned, maybe, or are there any plans of the future to do something similar, or are you just too busy with the data that you already have?
This looks like a lovely opportunity to pitch to the Erasmus Mundus program.
Thanks for that, Olivier. When we decided a year ago that we would run this survey with addressing the year 2019, we obviously did, as Werner Pitsch said in the presentation, we did that because of COVID. We couldn't ask for the present season because no competition took place, and people had downscaled their training quite a bit. And when we did that, when we asked the question back for 2019, we obviously knew that there would be recall bias. And that's just something we had to take into account, and it's a limitation with the study. Therefore, we also thought that, well, when the vaccines are rolled out and everyone are back in business in the autumn of 21, then we can run the survey again, perhaps in early 22. As the situation is right now with COVID around Europe and infection rates are increasing, then for now we have decided to put a parenthesis about doing the survey again. The best reason to do the survey again would be that we could get higher numbers, more respondents, and more truthful answers, that sport would have been open for a full season for every recreational sport and recreational athletes. And as that doesn't appear to be the case for the moment, we have decided to hold the idea or put a parenthesis around it, at least for the time being.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. Okay, yeah, well, thank you very much. I mean, I think this is a really important piece of important sort of study. I always feel it's important to try and assess the prevalence, which is we need to know what we're talking about, both in elite sports and recreational sports. There's a lot of difference in the percentage of doping users. Is 5% or lower, maybe 20% or higher. More extreme figures have been mentioned in the past. And the information on prevalence is essential to decide also on the distribution of our efforts, where we put our money, research, education, or maybe detection. And then I always say that ideally I would also like to make a difference between intentional and unintentional doping for this particular group. It's basically the intentional doping that I'm worried about. And it is also essential information to discuss the always difficult question on the effectiveness of our efforts. I think we need to realize that there is no single perfect way in which we can assess prevalence, but we need several pieces of information, and we can join them together, and we can draw a conclusion in the most confident way. We're still away from the goal now, but we're moving forward, and efforts like this to gain more knowledge is very important. With the number of participants that you have reached, And yeah, and answers and results that you have found. I think it is a monumental step in this regard. I think the researchers, and I think all the participants, and everybody who's present today showed interest. So thank you, and good luck for the future, and I'm looking forward to the paper.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivier. Thank you very much for your summary comments there. They really put the survey into a very, very helpful context. So we're very grateful to you. So having had a kind of expert interrogation of the technical expert group one's work, we're going to hand over now to the dangerous bit where we don't know what's coming. It's the social media interaction. So let's see how people have engaged with us on Slido. I'll just take a short pause while we take up some of the interventions by the audience. So, well, we have a very well-known colleague in anti-doping research, Professor Andrea Petrozzi, starts the ball rolling. She's intrigued by the varying rate of instruction non-compliance. What's your explanation for this? I think Werner and Monika, you try.
Thank you, Andrea, for that question. But I think we already partly answered that question. It's instruction non-compliance can arise from not understanding the instruction, not handling the randomization device properly. That should be more or less equal for all the randomized response question. But on the other hand, instruction non-compliance can arise from a self-protective orientation of respondents who want to answer. And if the prevalence in the population of an embarrassing issue is very low, there will be very, very few people who can act in a self-protective way and who can, in that sense, cheat with our survey technique in a self-protective way. If the prevalence is higher, there are more people affected by that. And that can explain why those questions where we had the higher prevalence estimates are also those questions where we have the higher instruction non-compliance. But once again, this is speculation, and I don't like to speculate about what are the people about who don't act according to the instruction. Okay.
And just to add one point, we actually don't know, and I'm not sure if we ever will know, if not answering or not following the instruction will be a personal trait or just more or less a situation because of the situation. And that's why we cannot say, is it a combination between personal trait? So I typically cheat or don't follow the instruction, or is it just because the situation is so embarrassing that I don't want to follow? That can add on the difficulties to explain this non-compliance. Also some sort of speculation, but maybe we can have, because of this big data set, some more insights also into this group of non-compliant answers or respondents, and have these different questions, the different orders, we have to try to check if situations are more embarrassing, adding on to Werner's answer on the proportion, the prevalence of the yes answers, and try to find out more on this non-compliance group. But it's not, I don't know if it's possible to adopt those answers to other situations, because it's not clear if it's personal trait or if it's situation that causes the non-compliance. That's it. Just to add on your answer.
Sorry, ask you a bit of
Well, just to put it in context, it may also be a matter of what kind of group is responding, as we already talked about. If you ask a bodybuilder whether they have taken image-enhancing drugs, they would clearly know and understand that question. But if you pose the same question to a cyclist, they would be confused and think, well, what do you mean? Do I shave my legs? So the question here is also dependent on who you ask it, and that may be reflected in the non-compliance instruction as well, how high that rate will be. And as we have covered more than 200 different sports here in our survey, it's clear that non-instruction compliance may have various different reasons for various different subpopulations in the overall sample.
Well, thank you very much. We got answers to both of Andrea's questions. They got 2 for the price of 1, Andrea. There was a question regarding when the survey will be reported, and Europe Active will indeed, I'm sure, through its social media channels, indicate when the publications have hit the public space. We have a question also from Anders Schmidt-Winter. Given the methodological limitations of the survey, we're pushing a lot on methodology here, okay. Selection bias and conceptual issues, how confident should we be in the reliability of the numbers? Well, I think there's a really simple answer for that from you, isn't there?
There is a really simple answer from me. You can be as confident as with any other social scientific research here. If you have the same limitations, in the sense of response bias, the advantage here, which I see in relation to other studies with more simple instructions, with simple direct yes/no answers, is that we can be, on the one hand, can be sure that social desirability bias will be, or we can be at least a little bit confident that social desirability bias is lower than asking that in a direct questioning technique. And the other point is we have an estimate of instruction non-compliance, while with other questions, you don't have that. So often the rate of instruction non-compliance is seen as a disadvantage in the results which we present. But in the other sense of the word, we can indicate to which extent did our technique not really work with that group. And this, you don't have this with any other social scientific survey techniques. And this is why I think they are as reliable as any other social scientific data on that. And having said that, you should only rely on that figures if they can be replicated by independent other researchers. So Andreas, you're invited to drive that research by yourself and to report your data to us.
Just to add a short comment to that, the question from Anders Winter, namely that the overarching question, the premise here for choosing the RRT for this is, of course, that we perceive the question about doping in recreational sport to be an embarrassing question. Now, what we don't know is to what extent is it an embarrassing question. And again, this may differ hugely between different subpopulations of the sample. Some may consider that the question about using over-the-counter medication is an embarrassing question, and therefore the RRT is a really good instrument, whereas other groups would say that's as easy as answering whether I have eaten cucumber, and there the traditional survey may be a better method in that. So again, it boils down to the question of, does the group that we are approaching, do they see the question as embarrassing or not? And would social desirability therefore be a factor that we need to count in?
Okay, let's go back to Slido and see where we are with other questions. You've talked about the psychological variables here, and Olivier has said how important it is to get this to add to the emerging prevalence data, but you've used 4 words here that I want you to unpack for the people who've tuned in. Moral disengagement, self-efficacy, attitudes and values. Now, if you're not a psychologist, you might be lumping all these things together, except for that strange one, moral disengagement. So could you say how these are related, but maybe first say a little bit, what does moral disengagement really mean?
Okay, so yeah, moral disengagement is theoretically is something that Albert Bandura, so one of the fathers of the social cognitive theory, theorized, okay? And something very recent. It's not something like old theories of psychology. We're calling about 2018, so very recent theories. And it's something like, you know, when each of us, sometimes it happens that we do little bad things, okay? Let's say someone can park in Second Line. Yeah, I do. Yeah, I did it, you know. Sometimes I park in the second line, for example, in Italy. Okay, this is a cultural thing, but you know, southern Italy, I did it. So, and how really we can do this little bad behavior, or if we want to move this bad behavior to a global okay, environment. So sometimes we say something to ourselves to justify this behavior. And this is a way that we can find ourselves don't guilty, okay? For example, I park in the second line and I say, okay, but it's just 40 minutes. I'm not killing anybody. Everybody does it in Italy. So why should I not do it? So all this justification, they are theorized in a set of different moral disengagement, because disengage your morality, your values.
Now we could see how that might work in an elite sample. Has that really got application here in the recreational groups? Do they really worry about that? Or just that little level of recreation that's maybe pushing toward the elite group?
So I think that we cannot really answer this, but what the data are saying to us is that, yes, actually this is one of the predictors. So we know that if a recreational athlete is being tempted by using doping or is have positive attitudes toward doping, to do this behavior probably is using sort of justification to don't feel guilt about it.
Okay. And now, just before we move on to this one, I know we've got a great question about recreational gym users, but I'll just ask you, what do we need to know about self-efficacy and values? And why do we need to know this stuff, to know about whether people are doping in recreational sport?
Mike, if I can answer to this with what VADA is doing in the last 2 years, you know that more than me probably, that VADA is doing in the last 2 years saying we need to move to a value-based education. And we need to make this like a mandatory for all the federation and all the NATO. So why VADA is moving to this? You know, it's not doing, let's punish more people that use doping. But because also VADA recognize that we can try to, with educational, with intervention on these variables, we really can stop people doing that step over the border. So why this is important? Because these are the predictors. With the prevalence estimates, we know who are using or not. But why? Why are some people using it or not using it? And how we can intervene? We can punish who is going to use, or we can prevent the use. Or we can emphasize the moral values that, you know, people start to use like a model of clean athlete. So this is what I think about these variables and why these are important, both in recreational and elite athletes.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. So I think Ask This One's coming your way, given the amount of research that you conducted on doping and other kinds of substance users in gyms. At least one of our interventions says, you know, I really would have expected higher prevalence in gym users than, for example, other sport forms. What do you say to that?
I would have expected that too. That would be my first reply. And this may be the case when we dig deeper into the numbers, that we can actually see that those who do fitness competitions, gyms, or strength training in gyms, that we will have higher numbers there. So the first thing we saw from the results that Werner Pitsch presented was that we did have a higher prevalence among males than among females. And that is also, besides being an indication as it's generally seen, it's also what we would see in the gyms. Now, as we've said several times, we have more than 200 sports, and some of the things people typed in would be fitness, strength training, weightlifting, power training, etc., or other types of activities that are in the gym. What is in front of us is to find out exactly what of these sports do represent bodybuilding, fitness, strength training, and then compile them into one category and see if we have enough replies that we can calculate prevalences. And if we do, and if we can see that the replies have the quality that we hope, then we can check what the prevalence is. And my expectation would be that we see higher prevalences than we have seen in the overall results.
We've already had a follow-up on Slido, which suggests, you know, existing data says anywhere between 3.6 and 18% in different kinds of studies. Yeah. That's a long way up from your figures.
It is, and the reason for that, my initial reply to that would be that these are targeted surveys against a targeted population, whereas our population here is as wide as 200 different sports. So when we target it down to what we could define as the fitness category or the weightlifting category, we may see that as well. That is data that are comparable to what we have from other surveys. But we'll have to do the analysis first.
Monika.
And just to add on, as I mentioned in the beginning, here we don't have a specific sports and not a specific substance. As Ask said, if it's targeted in the gym field, typically it's targeted to this group, or sometimes only male, a younger population, and also sometimes just specific substances. That's also different to our target, to have an overall view on different substances, doping in a more broader view, sports, the overall view, all different age groups, and so on. And if we have the numbers, as the colleague said before, we can jump into more detail. If we don't have the numbers, we have to say we cannot go into this deep detail, but we wanted to have the information on the overall view of recreational sports doping in Europe. That's the idea.
Okay, and that's going to be really important because that specificity, are they members of a group, or of a team, of a culture? To what extent are they individual in their motivations and orientations and milieu? Okay, that's going to be a really important dimension for further research. I'd just like to, we've got 1 or 2 minutes left, I'd just like to probe a little bit this sort of 40% figure. Now, as everybody who knows about wider policy in elite sport, it doesn't matter whether you want it for therapy or whether you want it for enhancement. If it's on the list, you're doping, unless you've gone through this very specific process of a therapeutic use exemption process, right? So your motivation is irrelevant. Now, how do you unpack this 40% figure who are using over-the-counter medication? The question was about enhancement, but the distinction between therapy and enhancement is so blurred, I'm not sure how we should really read this. What thoughts do you have over that?
So, okay, Mike, I'd like to put the figure first in the right context. These 40% were not for performance enhancement, it was for other reasons than performance enhancement.
Yes.
And that is the intriguing issue here, I think, that medication use in the context of sport should be seen in a very broader context.
So let me interrupt you. So for everybody who's listening, let's give this a really concrete example. So if I'm stacking up on anti-inflammatories before I go for my tennis match, am I trying to use it as a therapy or as an enhancement? Because it looks to me like it might be both things at the same time. That's the ambiguity I'm after.
Well, and what you are pointing your finger right at there is, how does the respondent understand the question related to doping? So so that is what Werner Pitsch emphasized in his presentation, that we do have vague concepts here, and the concept between enhancement and therapy is one of those concepts that is not easily defined. And if it's not easily defined by researchers, how easy is it to define it for a respondent responding to a questionnaire? But we did emphasize in the question that for other reasons than performance enhancement. So it was up to the individual respondent to interpret that in the way he or she thought would be the correct way to interpret it.
But I think I don't really agree that it's hard for respondents to differentiate in their behavior if it was for performance enhancement or for therapy. So we should not simply take our problems with the definition, with the limitation between therapy and performance enhancement, and transport that to the situation of, for instance, a middle-aged recreational rider who wants to go for a bike riding tour with his friends, and his knees are hurting. That's the situation. I think at that moment, it's not even for therapy. It's for not having pain in my knees and for doing sport with my friends and having fun and doing sport.
So that kind of leads into a kind of related question about the point of anti-doping, and this afternoon, the point of anti-doping education. Because the use of over-the-counter medications or the misuse of over-the-counter medications looks like an interesting zone. Do we want to say this is a matter for anti-doping education or for education or other kind? So we'll try to pick that one up, because that's an important kind of area. We'll pick that up this afternoon. I give you the last word.
Thank you, Mike. But I just think this discussion and the Q&A very much emphasizes the problems that we also try to address in the presentation, namely that there is a difference here between how the researchers interpret the questions and how the respondents interpret that. And then there is, I think, a huge difference between do you use medicine at all in your life, or do you use prohibited performance enhancers to increase your performance. Those questions appear to be wide apart also in this survey.
Well, thank you very much. Let me, on behalf of everybody who's attending today, thank Andrea, Monika, Ask and Werner for a really interesting survey. As I say, I don't think those results would have been predicted before we started, and we're yet to unpack their full implications for anti-doping, but thank you very much indeed. Welcome back, everybody, to the FAIR 2 show. Sorry for the technical glitch there. I'm going to reintroduce Fernandez Esteban, who's Deputy Head of the Sport Unit at the European Commission, and she'll begin her talk right from the beginning again. I know that a couple of you were able to hear the first few minutes, but we're going to begin right from the beginning. Over to you, Marisa.
Thank you, Mike. And first of all, I want to thank Erasmus for inviting me to say a few words about how we support anti-doping efforts in the European Commission. And here we go with the presentation. I want to highlight that anti-doping is always one of our main priorities in our policy documents and in our funding schemes. There is this framework called EU Work Plan for Sport. It's adopted by all the sport ministers of the European Union. And as you can see, there are three main pillars of this EU Work Plan for Sport that will last from 2021 to 2024. And there, one of these pillars is protect integrity and values in sport. So there, of course, we count the fight against doping. So we have to keep this in mind. And also, if we look at our current and future priorities in EU sport policy, you can see healthy lifestyle for all. I will come back to this. Social inclusion through sport, green sport, and the introduction of a mobility scheme in Erasmus Plus for sport staff, and international cooperation in sport, and of course, good governance in sport. And there we include, of course, the fight against doping. This action and this project, FAIR Plus, is supported by Erasmus Plus. And there is just a glimpse of the horizontal priority in Erasmus, which are also our priority in the sport actions. And then there in the slide, you can see the sport-specific priorities, encouraging the participation in sport and physical activity, promoting education in and through sport, combating violence and tackling racism, discrimination, and intolerance in sport, and of course, promoting integrity and values in sport. And there, again, we find the fight against doping. In addition to Erasmus Plus and the funding of projects like the FAIR Plus projects, we have extra funding coming from the European Parliament. This year, we have 3 pilot projects and preparatory actions. As you can see, one is sport as a tool of integration and social inclusion of refugees. The second is grassroots sport programs and infrastructure innovation. And the third one is devoted to doping, building investigative capacity to better fight doping in sport in Europe. So you can see that also for the European Parliament in the field of sport, they found that this was a top priority that deserved to be funded. And so we got this extra funding of 1.5 million. And the assessment of this call is still ongoing. So our commitment is to fight doping at all possible levels. First, at the international level. So we have a close cooperation with the Council of Europe. We fund actions supporting the fight against doping that are implemented by the Council of Europe. We have a close cooperation with WADA. And then this week, there is the Kahama meeting of the Council of Europe countries that prepare their position before the future meeting of WADA, and the European Commission will take part as an observer in this meeting. I will take part. And of course, we have a cooperation with UNESCO as well. So this is the international level. Then we had the Commission Expert Group on Anti-Doping that took place before the current World Plan for Sport, and they produced the first draft of amendments to the World Anti-Doping document, the World Anti-Doping that is so important for athletes. With Erasmus and with the pilot projects from the Parliament, we fund specific studies like the FAIR Project, so I have the pleasure to speak at this conference, and of course the study on doping in recreational sport that has produced so important results. And also to support the building of evidence and cooperation on anti-doping, we have produced in June 2021 the study on the fight against anabolic steroids, human growth hormones, and prohibited methods in sport. So this is available online, and if you go to my presentation, you can even click on it and have access to the study of the European Commission. So I just want to close my intervention mentioning one of our priorities, which is the healthy lifestyle for all. It is a commitment, it's a communication campaign to promote a healthy lifestyle for everybody. It's a 2-year initiative, and all organizations, big and small, public and private, are called and invited to submit a pledge to commit to promote healthy lifestyle for everybody. And doping has a place in it. So I want to mention, just closing my intervention, the Healthy Hour by Euroactive, which is one pledge to encourage Europeans to lead an active lifestyle. And of course, even we have a pledge by WADA, promoting a healthy lifestyle for people engaged in recreational sports, to develop new educational programs to be hosted on its anti-doping education and learning platform. So here the link, which was said before, the importance given to education in the fight against doping. And finally, my final words, I want to encourage every one of you organizations to, if you feel, to think about introducing a pledge to promote healthy lifestyle for all. Even anti-doping is one of the, as you can see, one of the elements of this healthy lifestyle for all. It's enough to put it in the Google healthy lifestyle for all pledge board, and you will find our pledge board, and it's very easy to submit the pledge. So thank you very much, Mike. Thank you very much, Cliff, for this opportunity. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you very much, Marisa. That gives a really helpful Europe-wide policy context for the FAIR Plus study. Thanks to my colleagues from the Technical Expert Group 1 and to Olivier de Haan of the Netherlands Anti-Doping Authority. That concludes the morning session, and we look forward to welcoming you back for our focus on the educational implications of the study and its findings this afternoon. See you soon. This afternoon is Technical Expert Group 2. It's a group largely led by very experienced personnel from national anti-doping organisations working in collaboration with research at Leeds Beckett University. The focus for this afternoon is on educational interventions, and people are always asking about education, what works, how it works, when it works, why it works, for whom it works. The older model, perhaps, was really a model that you could call a limited model of education. It was really just information giving. Well, for someone who's spent nearly 4 decades in education working, you can give all the information you like, but education can't be forced on unwilling minds, as the great philosopher of education, Richard Peters, once said. So what does education look like? What should it look like in the sphere of anti-doping and in the context of recreational sport? So I'm going to introduce to the panel Erik Duiven from the Dutch Authority for Doping. He's going to be joined a little bit later on by his colleagues, but we have Dr. Laurie Patterson. She'll come in a hybrid fashion online, and Dr. Laurie Patterson will produce some qualitative research and share that with you as part of this technical expert group. And finally, we'll have Dr. Michael Petrou from the Cyprus Anti-Doping Agency to reflect on those qualitative research findings. But to kick us off, we have Erik Duiven. Erik.
Thanks. Welcome all. I'm here to give a short presentation on the work of the Technical Expert Group 2. And the work is around the educational guidelines for recreational sport coaches. As Mike said, I'm not doing this alone. I'm working together with Michael Petrou from Sayara, Cyprus, and Fredrik Lauritzen from Anti-Doping Norway. So we're doing this with the three of us, but I'm here to present where we are, and also it's an introduction to the work of Laurie Patterson, who will come after me. So what's the objective of the Technical Expert Group 2? It's to provide recommendations on how to set up effective educational programs targeting recreational sport coaches, instructors, and trainers. That's one part, and the other part is to look on how to evaluate and measure their efficacy. So that's the broad thing that we are trying to research here. And since definitions matter, we thought it would be good to give our definition for recreational sport, because it's quite a broad one. We go from competitive indoor-based sports at sport events to even outdoor non-competitive events, like running outside just before you go to work and things like that. So it's really broad. That's how we defined recreational sport. And for our project, we had 3 years. We also had 3 phases, one for each year. And last year, we already presented that we did some quantitative surveys. We went out to sport organizations and anti-doping organizations to ask whether they have any educational programs really including the coaches that are working in recreational sport. So we set out that a survey to 102 different organizations, and 48 of them replied. And as you can see on the slide, we had international federations, 7 who replied. We had different national anti-doping organizations, 38 of them, of which 28 were donations from the EU. And then we had some other organizations, 3 of them. And in total, these 48 different organizations, 36 of them said that they had educational programs really looking at the coaches for recreational sport. So that was phase 1 last year. This year was focused around the qualitative interviews. What we wanted to do is check really what the programs were about, how they are evaluated in depth, and to get more knowledge. So that's what we did this year. And we said we don't want to do it ourselves because we are 3 members from national anti-doping organizations ourselves. So we wanted to have a little bit more independence and asked Leeds Beckett University to do this bit for us. But we wanted to do 15 interviews, and we have 36 different organizations. So what we did do is decide on what organizations to approach. So we used additional questions for that. We looked at, were any of these programs specifically targeting the coaches that we are looking at in recreational sport? That was 1. 2, is the program evaluated? And 3, is there a report of the conclusions that's available? If all 3 questions were answered with yes, we would include that organization. And in the end, we had 11 organizations for which that applied. But we had 15 spots, so then we included also 4 other organizations that didn't do a formal evaluation. They did some kind of evaluation, but didn't write all the conclusions down in a report. And then we still had a few spots left. And we said, okay, we have 2 organizations that we want to include based on their size and reputation, although they didn't do any evaluation of their program. Of these 17 organizations, in the end, we managed to get 13 organizations to do interviews with. That's the work that we did, and Laurie Patterson is going to talk about what the findings were of those different interviews. But just to conclude, my part is for next year, we're going to use the information from the survey and from the interviews together with the opinions of different experts to develop the guidelines that we need in order to help us with the further development of the educational programs. So that's it for me. I want to thank everybody who contributed with the survey, with the interviews, and Leeds Beckett University for all their input and hard work. And I'll give the floor back to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Erik. So we'll move on now to Dr. Laurie Patterson from Leeds Beckett University. Laurie's online, and we're looking forward to hearing more about the qualitative research that you conducted regarding the educational interventions. Over to you, Laurie.
Hi. Sorry, I'm just trying to share my screen and it says the host disabled participant screen sharing. It did work on Monday when we did a trial.
It's now been corrected. Sorry about that. Are you ready to continue?
No problem. Okay, so is that working? Can everybody see my slides?
That's super. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the thank you, Erik. It's been a pleasure to work with you all. So great to be here, part of this event. As Erik described, our relationship to the project is one of, I suppose, an independent friend or consultant. So we've been supporting with this particular phase. I think Erik's already done a great job of explaining what the phase was about. So it was an extension of their survey, which had already started to begin to capture what was being done for coaches. In particular, obviously the TEG 2 group wanted to drill down into the recreational context. So they were looking at coaches who worked in recreational context, coaches, trainers and instructors actually. This is the terminology that we used specifically because of the diversity in that particular area. And the aim or objective really for us was to get to grips with what is happening. So is there anything great out there in terms of education for those groups? What can we learn from it, and what can the TEG 2 team take forward into the recommendations that they wish to develop to help the community at large? So we were looking at the specific content of programs in terms of delivery methods, activities or tasks that they comprised, and topics that they covered. And then we also were trying to get to grips with how an organisation goes about introducing a programme for these populations. So what's involved in the development process, how are they then delivered? And then obviously, as Erik said, one of the key focus was on evaluation. So do these programmes actually work? And if they do, obviously that's helpful in terms of them utilising those insights for recommendations for others in the future. So that was what we were tasked with. As Erik again gave a really good introduction, so I won't kind of go over this too much, but it was about us interviewing these groups. So they'd done a survey, they'd got some great insights from that, but they wanted to dig deeper and really understand what was happening and how it was happening. So we spoke with 14 people. They were representing 13 organisations. So one of the interviews that we conducted had 2 people in there together, their colleagues, and they had different positions in the organisation that meant that both of them were able to give some form of insight into the education provision that they had. So we spoke primarily to national anti-doping organisations. There were 11 people from those in particular, and then we had 3 other individuals representing other sport and fitness organisations. So we had 2 non-profit organisations and 1 international federation. Okay, so that's who the voices are that will be speaking for today. So we conducted semi-structured interviews, and you won't be surprised to see the types of questions we asked based on what we've explained the focus of the study was. But we essentially started very broad, asking about the general learning opportunities available. And then we went off onto various different tangents to drill into those areas that the TEG 2 group really wanted to know more about. So, you know, you say, for instance, in your survey that you do an evaluation. You know, what does that involve? Can you tell us about the measures or the methods and you know, what you do with that information? Not that you'd be that interested maybe, but the data we analysed using thematic analysis. So that's basically a process of going through all of the interviews and looking for patterns. Some of the patterns might be consensus, so where people agree on things, and some of the patterns might be where people had different opinions, but all around a central issue. Okay. So let's get right into the findings then, because I know that's what you'll be most interested to hear about, especially if we've got lots of practitioners on the call. There were, well, I suppose one of the main things to say from the outset is that there was lots of variety. So across the way that things were done, very few organisations did things exactly the same way. Okay, and I'm sure you won't be that surprised to hear that. There were certain methods that obviously were used more than others, and they were listed here on the slide: face-to-face sessions, hard copy materials, so that's essentially printing things like leaflets or booklets, and also online resources and applications. So mobile phone applications in particular were mentioned by one organisation. In terms of these methods, it was typical for organisations to use several at once, and one NARDO, just to kind of give you an example, described this as their toolbox on interventions. So they said their programme consists of everything from the traditional lecture to more interactive ways of teaching groups face-to-face, such as little videos or even webinars. Now, another example of diversity was in the activities. So we talk about delivery methods as the overall way of reaching the community. And then when we've reached the community, what do we really get them to do in terms of tasks? And again, lots of variety in terms of scenarios. Some used question and answer, some used videos, etc. Some used a combination of all of these things. And again, another example from Anado, just to give it you in their words rather than mine. They said we get them to consider how they would react if they suspected the use of doping. So we think about all the different things which they could discuss within the sports club, and based on that, they come up with solutions. Interestingly, they then went on to explain those solutions are challenged within the same learning opportunity, and again, at the end of that, they create an action plan. So you can see it's not so much, as Mike said as he introduced the session, that education used to be about information giving. That was kind of our traditional approach. You can see now that some of these organisations that we've been able to speak to more recently are doing much more than that. So they're trying to give people the opportunity to really debate what they should do or what they could do if they ever face these issues in their practice, which I think is a really positive development. And just another example of diversity, we didn't get lots of information on this, but we did have a few of the organisations discuss the intensity of their education. And what we mean by intensity is either the frequency at which they kind of engage with the community or the length of the learning opportunities that are offered. So you can see on the slide here, we've got a range of people, a range of things being discussed. So we've got on one side, one 1 hour session. It's a bit of a one hit, and then multiple sessions in the middle, like almost like a series or a course. And then at the end, we've got a more consolidated, longer engagement, so 1 day course. Now, interestingly, I think it's probably a timely thing to discuss, especially because here I am still online. The International Federation, who talked about their 1 day course, actually said that that's changed recently. So they had this 1 day course, they did it in person, but because of the pandemic, they've had to adapt to the way that they work, and it's now a 2 half-day course that they do online. So you can see there's kind of a dynamic nature to the provision as well that we need to keep in mind. So even though we've spoken to these people this summer, it could be that even now they've had to develop their provision going back to in-person events, if that's now permissible in their environment. And then lastly, in terms of the content, I want to just talk to you very briefly about the topics that were covered. Now, mostly the topics that we heard people speak about were familiar. So the World Anti-Doping Agency has this international standard for education. In the past, they also listed topics that might be included in education in the World Anti-Doping Code. And lots of the organisations had borrowed from that list. So they talked about particular topics from the list, which they felt were relevant to this context. And they were primarily risk of supplements and consequences of doping. some of the things that are on that list that they wouldn't necessarily have engaged recreational coaches, trainers and instructors with were your things like the substances on prohibited list, substances and methods on the prohibited list, and also anti-doping rule violations. And that's because those organizations describe these things as maybe not necessarily being as kind of significant to the recreational context. Just explaining how the topics they include are the ones that are most relevant. So just explaining this tailoring a little bit more. They said it's more focused on doping as a public health issue. So it's not that much on the prohibited list, medications and so on, but more about the use of supplements, which supplements or substances are illegal. So for some, there was an issue of national law that had to be covered within their learning opportunities, and illegal in the fitness centre context and so on. So specific to their environment. And just before I move on from this, just to let you know, there were a few topics that were included by organisations that were beyond the list provided by WADA. So you can see that people had a level of independence and kind of freedom in what they wanted to include. They were not just going through the list and using that as a checkbox exercise. They talked about national laws if they were relevant. They talked about their own organisation so that people had a good understanding of what they were there for and how they could support the population. And interestingly, they also talked very much about creating a safe environment, which they saw as a separate topic to anything that is listed by WADA, which I thought was quite interesting. Now, just to go back to the issue of tailoring, because I think it's quite important to talk about this. It's something that's come through in previous research as being really fundamental to helping education programs be effective. The organisation representatives all talked about the way that topics or information was presented differently to this recreational group. So firstly, they talked about the way that information is framed. They said that when they're dealing with elite groups or high performance, it's about ethics and it's about performance. So not breaking the rules, fair competition, etc. Whereas now when they're speaking with recreational coaches, trainers and instructors, they very much ground their information and their messaging in public health. So are they safe in what they're doing, and are they informed in the way that they're making their decisions? Beside the way the information is framed, the level of information that is given was also highlighted by the educators. So they said that in the elite context, they might be a bit more specific or complex in the information that they provide, because there's an assumption that the coaches there might have been exposed to anti-doping education on multiple occasions over the course of their career. And you can see in the quotes, this is something that's highlighted. And in contrast to this, they thought that with the recreational population, it was important to stay quite general. So you can see the second quote in particular says, "We try to deliver as much as possible in the information about those topics, but I would say it's in a very general way because they're not experts. It cannot be very heavy or overloading. It must be something simple and easy to digest." So the tailoring was really an example of how knowledgeable and skilled the educators were that we were managing to speak to. So they really knew quite a lot, not just about doping, because their role was obviously in the National Anti-Doping Organisation for the most part, but they knew about education, they knew about effective ways to help people learn, and of course they knew a lot about sport as well and differences between sports. So they really were quite capable individuals. In addition to being capable, they were very driven. So there was a real motivation to make a positive difference, and that's why they were doing what they were doing. Oftentimes they explained that what they're doing is driven by them alone or them and another individual in their organisation. And that's because they've got this passion to want to do something good, and they actually want to counteract inaccurate information that is out there. So one of the things they raised specifically was this concern about recreational coaches, trainers and instructors having access to credible information. And that was something they really emphasised. Now, going beyond the individual, so the fact that they're capable and they're motivated, they said they felt supported. So there were various forms of support available, including resources and the ability to learn from others. That's something that they really emphasised as being significant for them in their role. So coming towards the end then, there's only a couple more things to cover. There were some challenges, so I've probably painted quite a positive picture there in terms of these individuals and their passion, but they did find it quite difficult at times to reach the population of interest. Though the population is very big in terms of recreational coaches, instructors and trainers in most countries and in most sports. That was a difficulty, and because of the size, it was quite diverse in terms of cultural differences. If you think about across sports, for instance, there's lots to consider. And then alongside this, their access to the community was not necessarily that easy compared to elite sport. So it can be difficult to engage with the community. And interestingly, obviously giving value to this project, there was a lack of research with recreational populations. And so they found it difficult to have evidence-informed practice. Now, some of the challenges, I think it's important to say, were couched within monitoring and evaluation in particular. So they talked a lot about monitoring and evaluation, and the challenges with that were essentially tied up in how things were done. So mostly things were done through a post-event survey. So immediately after an education experience, whether that's online or in person, a survey was handed out and people were asked to say how good the session was, what they would change about it, and maybe, what was the best thing about it. Also, they might be given a few questions that challenge them in terms of, have they learned what they were supposed to learn? Can they recite rules? Can they find information? Have we managed to sway their opinion in some way? We changed their opinion with the interactions that we've afforded them. And the challenges of that were that we don't really know if things are working in the long term. So if we ask someone immediately after the session, was this good, blah, 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 that might be different to how they would feel about something further down the track when they've had a chance to really figure out if it's been useful to them in practice. And also, we don't know if anything actually happened. So did they go away into their practice and do something with that information, that experience? And so suggestions in terms of improving evaluation and monitoring in the future were to figure that out, to have a system in place that enabled ongoing data collection systematically over time. And essentially they said, in order to achieve that, they would need a measure that they could trust. So more collaboration is about working with universities in particular, they said, not that it seems a bit biased coming from me, but they did say about working with universities to develop something like that, a tool that they could use time and time again. Okay, so conscious of time, so I'll just wrap it up there. Essentially, there's lots going on. Everyone does something in a different way, but there's not a problem with that because they're obviously trying to do something that works in their context for the people that they're working with and also with the resources that they've got. The amazing thing is this group are clearly committed to the cause, so they're really passionate about doing something. So if these recommendations are developed, I think they will be used, hopefully. But there are some gaps to fill in terms of being able to recommend good practice around monitoring and evaluation in particular, and that might be something that requires a bit more thought or a little bit more research before we can really provide specific guidance, I would say. Okay, so thank you. Hopefully I didn't go too far over time. I'm sorry if I did.
That's all. Thank you, Laurie. That was perfectly timed, and you raised an awful lot of issues. I'm going to hand over very shortly to Dr. Mike Petrou, but before that, I'm just going to raise a couple of little things. You don't need to answer them now, but I think they're going to be coming up afterwards in the discussion. So I noted that last remark. There was a quotation which said it was a lot of fun, and that made me think of that word edutainment. And what's the goal of one of these sessions? Is it really so that people can enjoy them and get a bit of information? Because it strikes me that might be relevant for some of the part of the process, but if you're finding out that there's a national law, and this is what you do to make sure you don't break that law, I mean, presumably you don't care whether it's fun or not, you just want clarity of message and compliance. So the mixture of goals that are involved in an educational process for this very heterogeneous population is going to be very interesting to sort out, because you said various kinds of specificity are going to be important. Tailoring is the word that you used throughout. You said this group seemed very committed, but I'm not clear who comprises this group. Now you've got coaching, coaches, instructors, trainers. There are a variety of different roles, and one of the things I was thinking about is, where do they see education within the various roles that they have? Do any of them have education in their job description, or is it something they're just expected to do? Or is it at the front of what they do, such as with people like Erik? He's a director of education for NADO, so it's up front and centre for his role. Where does it sit within those other roles? Here we are talking online with 150 people signed up offline. Digital strategy, how specific is that going to be? I mean, if it's sort of older folks like me, the digital strategy might just leave me a little bit cold. It's absolutely the right thing to do with the younger populations. So that kind of specificity. You also mentioned credibility, which strikes me as extremely important. Who delivers the education might be more important than the actual messages themselves. So if it's me, who is at best a mediocre sports person, I don't know, maybe I'm not going to be effective as an educator for a doping and recreational sport, but by gosh, I could think of some fantastic elite sport role models who really would get the message across in a more meaningful and credible way. So you've raised just a host of other issues that need further exploration. But I'm not a NADO representative. I'm not an educational expert here in anti-doping. Mike Petrou, I hope, is going to bring forward his own set of perspectives to see how you see, from the responses of your sample, to see how these can sort of press into effective educational interventions. So thank you very much. Hold on for a second there, Laurie, and I'll invite Dr. Mike Petrou to the floor.
Thank you very much, Mike. Good afternoon from Cyprus. Apologies for not being able to join you in person in Brussels. I prepared a very short comment on the findings of the study from Leeds University. I will start first by saying thank you to Laurie and the Leeds University team led by Professor Susan Backhouse for conducting this study on behalf of Tech 2. Definitely the study findings are of particular interest for FAIR project. I would like to provide some comments regarding the study findings. As we heard from the previous speakers, the national anti-doping organizations and the sport organizations that were interviewed were purposefully sampled based on last year's survey, in which they stated that they provide anti-doping education for coaches in recreational sport. Nevertheless, the study findings did not provide strong evidence in favor of any particular approach which could be used as blueprint for other organizations to follow. Instead, the study participants share ideas that could be used in our search to develop recommendations for anti-doping education for coaches in recreational sport. The study confirmed the increasing interest for anti-doping education in recreational sport. This is in line with the universal trend that doping is a public health issue, not limited to elite level sport. It also confirmed that the important role of coaches for the prevention of doping is well acknowledged by all. Likewise, the study confirmed the increased role of national anti-doping organizations in the delivery of education in recreational sport in association with their national and sport partners. Going into the particular topics shown by this study, I want to comment on the diversity of practices across the participating organizations, which seems to be linked to their priorities regarding recreational sport, resources allocated, etc. The study identified also several barriers and enablers that are worth to be studied further before preparing the guidelines and the recommendations. And lastly, the study showed that the participating organizations are mostly monitoring instead of evaluating the implementation of their anti-doping programs. Therefore, it is one of our tasks to provide guidelines for organizations to put in place mechanisms for the meaningful evaluation of their anti-doping programs. To conclude, I want to thank again Laurie and Leeds Beckett University team. Anti-doping education for coaches in recreational sport is definitely an emerging topic, and we, FAIR Plus project partners, have a lot of work to do in this field. This is my commentary, Mike. Back to you.
Thank you very much indeed. So Erik is live in the studio. Mike, you're live online, so is Laurie. I'll see if there are any questions coming in through Slido, but let's just start at least one of them. Laurie, can you start by telling us a little bit more? And I'm mindful that through research ethics, you'll have promised confidentiality and anonymity, but can you say a little bit more about the sample so that we can understand better some of these comments and who indeed their target population would be?
Yes. So thanks for that. Yeah, so essentially, as I said, they're mostly national anti-doping organisations. Much like the survey that Erik mentioned, they were in Europe predominantly, obviously with the nature of the study that's expected because this is Erasmus+. But we did go outside of Europe as well to try to get different organisations, some larger, perhaps might be perceived as more well-resourced, to see if that impacted what they were doing. So mostly NARDOs, a range of different countries and sizes, and then, as I said, 3 different organisations which were two non-profits but were interested and invested in this area, and 1 international federation of sport. A large-ish sport is probably all I can say.
Well, I mean, it's great in a sense that you're invited to do this work because, of course, the NARDOs can't mark their own homework. And they can't go out investigating what other colleagues across the international NARDO network are doing. That would give all sorts of conflicts of interest. On the other hand, to call something a NARDO and to think about its educational function might give the impression of a certain homogeneity. But how did you diversify that sample? Because here we are in, I guess you'd say, Northwest Europe, in a fairly wealthy part of the world where NARDOs are supported well and they have big budgets. So have you got some sort of diversity here? Because I'm quite clear in my own mind that resource is going to be a major obstacle to any kind of educational strategy, whether from inception to delivery or to monitoring and evaluation. So tell us a little bit about the diversity, and then maybe Mike or Erik, you'll jump in about the kind of diversity in practice that you're aware of.
Yeah, it's a great point, and actually is something we found before. Many years ago, as part of my PhD, Professor Susan Backhouse and I actually found this same issue, the exact one you've identified, is that resource is key in terms of underpinning what people will do and how they will do it, and basically their capacity to be able to do anything at all. Oftentimes, individuals responsible for education, I think you said in your reflection on the presentation, they have other responsibilities. And so education is actually not all that they're employed to do within their organisation. It might be just a fraction of their role. And we definitely had that. So it's not something we paid particular attention to in the interviews. However, it was considered when selecting organisations, and obviously it was considered in the back of our minds. The TEG 2 group actually selected the organisations. So as Erik described earlier, primarily they were going on what the organisation said they did in the survey. So they were trying to choose people who said they do something, because obviously they're the ones that can tell us about the experience, and hopefully we can learn something from them, whether it's best practice or whether it's learning from mistakes or learning from challenges. So Erik or Michael might be best placed to talk about that element of things if they were keeping in mind the size of organisations. But looking at the list of organisations, which I have in front of me but clearly can't share, there's certainly different locations even within Europe, and different cultures, you would assume, and certainly different financial situations from my knowledge, in terms of kind of interactions in the past, and knowing how established some programs are compared to others in terms of how long people have been doing these things.
make that segue then, first to Erik and then to Mike. If Laurie's point is our sample is in part created from your first work package in the previous year based on responses to the questionnaire, that sample is already in a way self-selecting because these are the people who've probably given you positive stories. So as you kind of add a few further comments, might you try to reflect, and I know you will be hypothesizing slightly, what you think is not being heard because they didn't positively respond to the survey in the first phase?
It's a really valid point. What I said in the presentation is that we have approached 102 organizations across the world to see what they have in educational programs. But when you want to dig deeper and you want to see who did evaluations and who reported the evaluations, you come to a very select group of organizations. And these are the organizations that are based in the in Western countries, basically. So that's the pool that you get the most information out of if it's about what is being done in evaluating the programs. But luckily for the survey, we had 48 respondents, and they were from across the world. So we have more information. But then, yeah, again, if you want to dig deeper and you want to see what's being done and what's out there, you get to those organizations.
So let me make an assumption then that the Netherlands Doping Authority is in comparative terms reasonably well resourced, has a team of experts. We're going to go to, Mike, forgive me, a smaller country. I'm guessing a smaller resource base, whether human and financial. What kind of reflections do you add from your perspective?
Yes, thank you very much, Mike. Yeah, indeed, it's what I mentioned in my comments earlier that we have to keep in mind that the resources allocated and the different barriers that organizations face in delivering anti-doping education for coaches in recreational sport. And this is more evident when we are talking about small countries. I mean, countries that spend less money for anti-doping and sport in general. So when we will be developing the guidelines, we will have to make sure that whatever we will produce can be used for all organizations, small or bigger, and of course Europe, but also beyond Europe.
I think we have our first Slido question, so I'm going to see if we can move across to that. It says it's Anders. Welcome back, Anders. WADA published an evaluation handbook in 2009, written by Barry Houlihan. Do we know from the survey or interview study how widely used it is among NARDOs? Now, I think the right way to ask that question is to refer to a yes or no to Laurie, but then for my NARDO colleagues to amplify those remarks as they know best. Laurie.
Hi. Great question. We didn't ask about it specifically, but it didn't get mentioned much. What did get mentioned in the interviews was the NARDO package. So the World Anti-Doping Agency has another resource, which is the NARDO package. If you're familiar with this, it's available online, and it's essentially a series of questionnaires that have been put together to investigate a wide range of different factors. And NARDOs or whomever are encouraged to just borrow the surveys that they think are most relevant to their provision, essentially. So that's one thing that was mentioned by one interviewee as a resource that is used. In another project that we're working on, which is one of the main reasons that the TEG2 group came to us as a group to help them, we are auditing provision across the globe for coaches. So we've done a survey of our own, very similar, and interviews to follow up, very similar, but not with a focus on recreational coaches. And we specifically asked in those interviews, do you use any of the WADA resources, including social science reports? Now, not many people did. Actually, some organizations, not in the sample that we're talking about today, didn't know that those reports went online. So obviously we've reported back to WADA, and it's an issue for the EU to consider as well. is how do those reports become accessible and usable to the people who need the findings from that research? So that's just something to comment. So it's not 100% related to this project, but it does answer the question, I think, somewhat.
Thanks, Laurie. And I can't really speak for all the other organizations, but for us, it's also that the focus of WADA was for a long time on fair play and on the elite sport competition. And now we're talking about coaches in recreational sport. And I do think that there's a need to acknowledge the health issues more. For them, it's not about fair play, it's about the health issues. So therefore, maybe the documents that WADA are providing can be useful, but they should be tailored specifically for recreational sports, because you have, let's say, other rules in place there.
I think, Mike, you wanted to come in also in that comment.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly what was mentioned by Erik. Both documents, the WADA package and the evaluation tool prepared by Barry Hooligan.
So I'll just hold that point for just a second. So how much is the problem here? The development, diversity, specificity of educational packages, and how much is it accessibility? People not actually knowing where this stuff exists in a form that different organizations or individuals can take it and adapt it to their situation. I'll go first to Erik, and then Mike, I'm going to come back to you because I think we've got back our link with you.
Yeah, another valid point. What WADA is trying to do right now is also developing like professional standards and give more education to people in the field of anti-doping, so they get the knowledge and the skills they need sooner than what happens right now. So they get education from WADA on their specific roles, whether it's about intelligence or results management or education. And what you get then is that you get all the information from WADA more directly. So you are aware that it exists and that you can use it. So I think that's a huge step forward for us.
Okay, Mike.
Yes, thank you, Mike. I think it is important to recognize, to acknowledge the different interests for recreational athletes. And going back to what was mentioned earlier about the tools prepared by Barry Hooligan and WADA, both refer to elite level sport, which of course have different interests from recreational athletes. So I still believe that there is a lot of work that needs to be done when it comes to recreational sport and anti-doping education in this part of the of sport.
The next thing I'd like to sort of raise and address, maybe in two different kinds of ways, is early on in your presentation, you've got this lovely phrase, Laurie, learning opportunities. And as Erik, I'm delighted to hear him say definitions matter, because of course they do. If you don't pay careful attention to concepts, you can get all sorts of things wrong afterwards in practice. But education and learning opportunities, there's a different hue to the phrase learning opportunities. So could you tell us a little bit about how some of your respondents conceived of the variety of learning opportunities as opposed to a lecture or at least some kind of instructional format? Were there any sort of good practices that you were able to highlight from that?
Sorry, I did lose you partway through, but I think what you're asking is what did they describe as learning opportunities, essentially, instead of just tradition, is that right?
Yeah, in the mind of a lot of people who are tuned in, I guess education has got connotations of some sort of formal transaction or some formal setting. And it may be the case, especially with recreational sport, it's the informal settings that may be more important. So how do they conceive of learning opportunities, and what alternative or non-traditional forms of learning practices would you think were good practices?
Yes. So essentially learning opportunities is something that we use because we are kind of, exactly as you've described, we're acknowledging that many people learn more essentially from informal or non-formal approaches, especially coaches or other practitioners and kind of active participants. What was interesting was the way that people described even the formal, what you might consider a formal interaction. So for instance, they talked about face-to-face interaction. Obviously, we might assume that's formal education. But actually within that, they use different learning opportunities or tasks that were perhaps more or less formal, sorry. So they were more self-directed and independent. So there was actually this weird, I suppose, amalgamation of the way people learn. And actually there didn't seem to be that separation anymore of kind of self-directed stuff over one side and kind of formal directed things somewhere else, or mediated learning opportunities they're often called, where like someone's there to facilitate basically. What was interesting was this kind of approach now, like you mentioned earlier, digital strategies, and was that only for the younger generations or something? Because there was specific mention of the utility of an application. So is a mobile phone application a helpful way of learning? And that was something that an organization thought was the case. So they were using applications. And also social media. So one particular organization, and only one organization actually, discussed their use of posts on social media to try to get some kind of traction within the community, to kind of engage them in some kind of discourse and give them information, while at the same time figuring out what kind of opinions they've got on a topic, for instance. So that, like you said, might be only for particular pockets of the population. You might be surprised that, older generations are on social media too and like technology. It just depends, I think, who you speak to. So yeah, I don't think across this group, it wasn't so much about the formal anymore. It was about a face-to-face interaction, because the face-to-face interaction enabled them to learn so much more about the population. It wasn't something, which might have been how we thought of a formal education interaction in the past. It was about actually just gelling with the community, gaining credibility, which is something I mentioned before, and kind of forging relationships and better understanding who they're dealing with.
A little bit before I come back to Erik and Mike. The things that might capture people's attention and might get really good engagement might have quite low educational value. You can get depth of educational engagement when you've got people face to face over a period of time, but maybe you haven't got the time, maybe you haven't got the resource, maybe you haven't got the motivation on behalf of the people who are, after all, recreational athletes. Is there any kind of understanding about how you diversify these messages and the modalities, the media of these messages? Have you got any pointers for us there?
Not from this particular group, not going beyond what I said in the presentation in terms of the tailoring, in terms of, simplified information versus potentially more complex, rule-based, compliance-based information. So it's not something we explored. I think that because we were exploring so much with this group for the first time, it was the first time we'd really tried to get to grips with what's happening in the recreational context. There's definitely more questions to ask. And it might be that, the TEG2 group decide to go back to these stakeholders or go back to the community at large. Like Erik said, if they went to 108 or something originally, they might play back some of these findings to that group to see if they've got anything to kind of add, and you could potentially add these follow-up questions, because I think they're valuable. But it wasn't something we particularly drilled down into and managed to kind of gain any insights into on this occasion.
Let me hand it over to our two NADO folks then, and maybe position it. I mean, we've got ADEL, ADL, Education and Learning. Does that mean anything, or is that just an added word? I mean, how does the learning word actually transform what you do and how you do it?
I don't know if I understand this question, because we have ADEL. It's from WADA, and there are a lot of resources on there, and I think WADA at this point is also looking at how to use this platform in a good way. If it's for the anti-doping organizations, I think we come from a world in which we provide information on the immediate risks, on the rules and rights, and now we are building curricula really looking at what are the learning outcomes that we need to have at the end of a session, of a year, of a career, and then build on from there. So what do you want the audience to learn? And then you can see what type of platform is good for what type of learning objective that you want to achieve. For us in the Netherlands, it means that, for instance, online learning is more about getting knowledge across, and to have the start with skills development. But then when we go face to face, we go more on about how to develop those skills and what kind of behavior do we expect from the group, and how do others think within the group about that behavior. So you get an open discussion and you open up the whole item of the things that are more complex. Do you use painkillers, etc.? So it all starts with what do you want the audience to learn in the end, and then start on from there to see what kind of tools you need.
No, Mike, I'm coming to you next, but I'm guessing you're not one of the sample, right? I'm guessing that, and don't nod, look, or anything, but I'm just guessing that, right? So if you were one of the sample, it strikes me that one of the key messages here that we've discussed is evaluation. It's all well and good thinking you're educating, but if you aren't systematically evaluating, how do you ever know? So you've given us an array of different strategies for education. How do you go about evaluating them? Then Mike, I want to go over to you to talk about the sample and what you've read in Dr. Laurie Patterson's research and what you think should be happening with regards to evaluation before giving the last word to Laurie.
We are one of the organizations that struggle with evaluation. We have a program for over 20 years, but we have never properly evaluated what we do. We think we do the right things, but even for us, with quite some resources, we never came to a proper evaluation. So that's something that we need to improve.
Well, thank you for being candid about that, and sorry to put you on the spot. Mike, over to you.
No problem.
Yes, thank you, Mike. You know the difficulty when discussing about recreational sport, contrary to elite level sport, is that recreational is not a homogeneous group. Because if we're talking recreational, we refer to grassroots, or we refer to someone at the age of 70 who runs a marathon. So we understand immediately that we have a group that have different interests, contrary to elite level. They have different background in terms of understanding education, different priorities, different lifestyle, etc., etc. So this for us is a big problem. Now, with this in mind, if we're going to discuss about evaluation, the problem becomes even bigger, because we don't know what to evaluate. Is it how they understand the rules? Do they care about the rules? Is it how they understand life? Health consequences, maybe. But when it comes to evaluation of programs for recreational sport, I think the problem becomes really tricky how to tackle it.
Okay, so thank you, Erik. You've talked about the challenges. Mike, you've talked about the complexity. Let's have the take-home message now from Laurie. What are your summary highlight points from the research?
Oh, in general, overall, I think actually, since we're talking about evaluation, that is the real take-home for me, is that that's the area we need to work on more, and we need to kind of look to others to maybe learn from other fields, not just our own. So I know obviously we've looked internally at anti-doping at the moment and good practice, but there's a lot to learn from other areas as well about program evaluation and monitoring in particular. The two very much go hand in hand. It's not just about the outcomes of the program, it's implementation as well. Is it being delivered the way it was intended? If not, what are the kind of adaptations that we're making and what impact are they having? Sometimes I might be having unintended positive consequences, but we're not aware of them. So I think for us, in terms of evaluation, it's something we would always say should be planned from the outset. So as you design the program, you design the evaluation and the monitoring processes. Obviously, it's probably common sense, but it's not done often, and it should be embedded in the processes. So it's not something that's just an add-on. it's an iterative process, and it's going to help you in the long term. So as much as evaluation and monitoring are hard and can be quite resource intensive, and you might need to look beyond your own group to get some input and some expertise, it's the most worthwhile thing you can do, because it's the way that you get better. So nobody's got a perfect program, and we all need to adapt to the changes that are going on in the world. The quote about the COVID program showed us that, and the only way we'll be able to adapt more effectively and efficiently is if we understand which parts of our program are working and which bits we need to change or just get rid of entirely. So I think for us, it's just about paying more attention to evaluation from the outset, and not being afraid to ask other people who know more about it than we do even.
That's a lovely way to summarise. Thank you all very much. So may I then thank Fredrik, who's part of this technical expert group, but he's appearing in the next panel. Erik, thank you. Thank you, Mike. Laurie and the team in Leeds Beckett, thank you too. And we're going to take a 5-minute pause now before we convene the final panel. See you soon. Welcome back to this afternoon's session. We've invited 4 experts to come along to talk about the broader realm of education in anti-doping for recreational sport, and to bring their experience and expertise to bear, partly on what they've just heard, but partly on their broader experiences. So our experts are as follows. We have Dr. Sergio Lara-Bercial, we have Jukka Koskelo, Professor Adam Nicholls, and Dr. Fredrik Lauritzen. So Sergio, can I invite you first to take the floor and to offer your first thoughts on what you've heard in the previous session?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. What a fantastic group of people to be part of. So very, very thankful. It's been a really interesting listening, really, to everything that's been said in the previous session. If I can very quickly just introduce the organization that I'm representing, because that will help people make sense of what I'm going to say. So I'm here representing, I'm based at Leeds Beckett University, like Laurie, but I'm here representing the International Council for Coaching Excellence, which is a not-for-profit global organization which brings together around 50 plus countries, all with an interest of developing coaching nationally and globally. Now, as part of that, we create some frameworks for people to use in the way they develop their coaching systems. We also organize events, and we really support, sometimes one-to-one and sometimes in groups, the development of qualifications or systems around coaching. Now, in relation to anti-doping, I have to be completely honest, most of our involvement to date has always been at the elite level, at the performance level. So as I was listening to what was being said in the previous session, it is very interesting because, to be honest, some of the problems are very similar to any coach education problem that we see around the world at any level. And of course, there are differences between what happens at the performance level, and I think the way the description of whether this becomes a performance enhancement situation or problem or a public health problem is very, very pertinent, and it's something that we see very clearly. From our perspective, it becomes really coach education is always tricky because 80% of coaches are volunteers. We know that, and in some countries that percentage is even higher. So how do we get them first through the door or through the virtual door, and how do we then make it meaningful for everybody? It's a difficult situation. But we believe clearly that the coach is a very important person, if not one of the most important people in the decisions that are made by participants in relation to whether they're going to use doping substances or not. Now, the last thing I wanted to say before I let other people take the floor and then we start the discussion is, I'm also coming at this from a normal person's perspective in two senses, or three senses actually. As a former athlete that is now of a certain age, and things start to hurt, and your your achievements become less. So you might be tempted to enhance your performance one way or another. In my case, running. Okay, I like running, but I'm also a coach. I'm a basketball coach working with young people, with 15 and 16-year-olds. And to me, these guys are in the frontier, in the transition between recreational sport and performance sport. And I think that's a really critical moment, as we know from the research in relation to anti-doping, and also as a parent of a 15-year-old which is going through that transition. So everything that was being said, I was trying to relate to that from a professional perspective, but also from a personal perspective. And I think I'll stop that there for now, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Well, a couple of things there. First, you've introduced an important new category for us, because we're talking about elite and recreational as if they were exclusive categories, without bearing in mind the transitionals both ways, from recreational to elite, from elite to recreational. So that's going to be an important dimension to pick up, and that's not been remarked upon so far. The second thing to mention is thank you very much for giving the context of the International Council for Coaching Excellence. That's very important. I would also add, thirdly, you've given me a little bit of nostalgia, because the old building on the right is where I used to lecture 35 years ago. So thank you very much for that. Can I then turn to Jukka Koskelo from Doping Linki in Finland?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to be in this panel. It's a great pleasure to represent Erik Foundation and Finland and one of the Nordic countries, together with Fredrik here in the panel discussion. And what I was thinking about, well, during this day, that, well, I want to give a little bit like practical approach, what we have done here in Finland, together with my colleagues, in the field of the education. So, yeah, my name is Jukka Koskelo. Well, I've been working in the fields of recreational or public health side of anti-doping more than 11 years. Yes, time really flies. And if you don't know Doping Linki or what we do or who we are part of the non-governmental organization, Erik Foundation. Well, and that's one of the topics that Laurie just mentioned. That's, yeah, some of the organizations are non-governmental, and also in the research there was a NATO's, and we work closely with our NATO, Fingers, and well, they are responsible for anti-doping controls, manipulation of the sports competitions, spectator safety, and ethics in sports. Yeah, I remember all of them. So, and our work in recreational sports in the field of anti-doping started 2012. So, well, in Finland, so we have two different organizations working in the field of anti-doping. So it's a little bit different than in many other European countries, but well, the structure, well, it works well in our country really, really well. Okay, education is one of our main functions, and well, it plays really, really important part of our daily work. And in the field of the education, we started an online program in a couple of years ago, I think more than 5 years ago, for fitness professionals. It was online or e-learning program because, well, yeah, well, Finland is a big country. Well, and we have limited resources, limited funding, long distances, and so on. So it's a cost-effective way to do it. But well, also we provide, well, traditional, well, virtual, face-to-face education for students in sport academies time to time. But well, that's how we do our daily work. And well, one of our goals is just to provide information for fitness professionals or students who are just studying the fitness industry, coaching, you name it, personal training, you name it, and that they just gonna have good knowledge about anti-doping in recreational sports, so they can talk about with their target groups and based on the knowledge what they learned during our education. But well, how they're going to implement the knowledge when they are talking about with their target group, well, that's something that we really don't know. And well, so far, well, in recent years, I was checking today our statistics. Well, more than 1,800 professional or students have participated in our online program. So it's quite a big number. So, and of course, well, Erik just told about the evaluation. So have we done it? Well, in a proper way? No, we haven't. So we have asked after the completing the e-learning course, some kind of feedback. How can they use the current knowledge, what they learned during the course? So, and all kind of practical information. But well, is it enough? Well, for us, well, it's some information, and well, it's not like a guarantee that well our educational program is the most effective and the most well educated. Well, it's not that. So we are in the same situation than probably in the many other countries as well. But well, also during our previous Erasmus Plus projects called DELTs, we measured the acceptability, usability, and the implementation of our educational tool. So a couple of months ago, we just published an academic article about these results. So that's something what we have done in the past, but well, there's a lot of work to be done. And I think, well, there are many like benefits about the e-learning programs and well, the evaluation and well, studying the usability. But like it has been said a couple of times during today, so we definitely need the evaluation, the proper ones, to be implemented to reach more and more people and well, many other things as well. So that's my short introduction about this topic from my side.
I'm going to hand over now to Adam Nicholls, who's a professor at the University of Hull. He's a professor of psychology and he's conducted a number of studies around anti-doping in education. Of what you've heard so far, Adam, what are your first thoughts?
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, and I'm, many thanks for inviting me to give this talk. So I prepared quite a short presentation. Could you just confirm that you can see my my slides?
Thank you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yeah, so I guess I've been invited onto here due to my experience in conducting an Erasmus-funded project called Anti-Doping Values in Coach Education, also known as Advice. And we made an attempt to evaluate this program.
Adam, can I just interrupt you for just 1 second? I've been asked by the technical team, can you go to full screen, please?
Sorry. Am I not full screen here now?
The technical team say now you are. Thank you. Sorry about that. So you were just introducing yourself and the reasons for your invitation to today.
Yeah, I'm on full. Right. Okay. Yes. So sorry, apologies. I've got my my 1-year-old's crying in the room next door, but hopefully he can't hear that. He's just had his nap time. He's just waking up. So yeah. So I've conducted research, particularly with adolescents, which has been funded by WADA, in which we develop questionnaires to help evaluate programs. I've conducted an IOC-funded research project, which we developed an education program, particularly for high-level adolescent athletes who are on talent programs, who are on the cusp of wanting to make it to the elite level. And then this project is about Anti-Doping Values in Coach Education. It was a mobile app specifically designed for grassroots coaches, and it was funded by Erasmus+. So I'm going to get into just a little bit about the program, and then also I'll discuss about how we evaluated it. So we developed an application which had specific aims about how coaches can promote clean sport, positive values, how they can develop their environment, the motivational climate, how they can build relationships. These were all factors that, as the research team, the team we put together, thought were factors which would help promote clean sport or help grassroots coaches play clean sport. In the context of what we've already said, of what was said by Sergio about most of them are volunteers, very few have coaching qualifications, particularly in the UK. And as a consequence, we developed 5 specific modules, which we called advice on fair play, advice on supplements, substances, rules, and support. The mobile app is available in quite a few different languages, as you can see there: English, French, Spanish, Russian, Greek, etc. And I'm just going to talk about, sorry, have I left full screen again? Sorry. I'm just going to talk now about evaluation, because I think this is relevant to this specific panel. So we tested the app, which we developed, via a randomized controlled trial, and how we evaluated it. And by no means saying this is perfect. I think there was time constraints, but we used questionnaires, and we assessed the impact of the mobile application on coaches' knowledge, and also the impact it had on coaches' attitudes towards doping. Because we knew from the literature that quite a lot of coaches have very limited to no knowledge of performance-enhancing drugs and also nutritional supplements. And some, not all, even possess favourable attitudes towards coaches. So this was the way in which we evaluated it, and we found that the app was effective at achieving the aims of the project, increasing coaches' knowledge and also reducing favourable attitudes. And I think one thing that we didn't do was look at the athlete's perspective. So what were the views of the athletes who were coached by some of these coaches? And that would be something that we'd look to develop in future studies. Okay, that's yeah. Thank you very much for listening, and I will stop sharing now.
Much, Adam. That gives nice context, and I'm going to move across immediately to Fredrik Lauritzen from Anti-Doping Norway. He's got a unique kind of identity here because we're inviting him as an expert, but of course he is also part of the construction of the work of TEG2. So from what you've heard, you're going to open up, summarise, bring in the next part of the discussion. Fredrik, over to you.
Well, thank you, Mike. And I would also like to thank all the presenters and participants asking questions for giving us valuable input for the work we're going to do next year with the guidelines. I would like to step back to Laurie's presentations and the interviews, because we've seen now, and also from the survey we did last year and from the interviews, that there's quite a few organizations having these programs for coaches in recreational sport. So even though it's an emerging field, it's starting to mature a bit, and I think the next step now is to increase the focus on evaluations. But you also see from the answers in the interviews that can be quite tricky. Even from the resourceful NATOs, it is difficult to do proper evaluations. So I think we will have to provide some simple guidelines on how to set up this, because it's obviously important to measure whether these programs are effective. And also by doing that, provide examples to other organizations so they can set up their own programs for this group.
Okay, what I hope we can do now is to go into a situation where we can see all 4 of our experts and ping a few questions to and around them. And as we're doing that, the first and probably the most obvious question to ask is one about responsibility. Whose job is it to do education, and what might that education look like? Now, we saw this morning issues about a large part of the population that was studied were interested in over-the-counter medications. Now, the questions they were responding to was about non-enhancement use of medications. That's a bit of a porous border between therapy and enhancement there, I would say. But how is that going to inform how you do education now? Because somebody from the outside might say, well, I haven't got the resources to do that, give me more resources. Or they might say, and I'm going to start with you on this one, Fredrik, they might say, well, if the major part of our focus here is in recreational sport and we're giving public health advice, perhaps harm minimization advice even, if it's public health advice, why is the NADO doing it? So when I put that question to a head of a European NADO 10 years ago as part of another project, they said to me, absolutely no difficulty doing that and no problem, but can you make sure the minister doubles my budget, please? So how do you, as a person working in a NADO, every NADO's got limited resources, how does that land with you when you say, well, really, if you care about doping in recreational sport, you care more about harm and health messages. How does that land with you?
Well, it's a very good but difficult question to answer. I think it will depend on the country and organization also. And there might be different ways to do this. I think the NATOs, they will play a role in coordinating these efforts because no one else will do it. That's at least my impression. But we have to do it in collaboration with the sport movements, medical professionals, fitness clubs, schools when it comes to educating youth and so on. But we can be coordinating this, providing programs, and we have to do this together with others.
Okay, well, what I'd like to do is, if I might do, Jukka, can I go to you now? I mean, we're in the same part of Europe. Whether you've got as much heterogeneity as other people, I don't know. Whether you've got budgets as large as Norwegian NADO, I don't know. But what do you think about this? What do you think about this query? Is this mission creep, or is this a proper recognition of what our role should be in education for recreational sport?
Well, I completely agree there, because we just have to do the work together, cooperation between different organizations. And well, I'm sorry, my neighbor is renovating suddenly. Okay, that might happen. And yeah, cooperation between different organizations. And this might, well, and the resources, well, I think, well, of course, well, when you're just doing the public health side of the anti-doping work, the resources should be, well, balanced and not big enough to support all the educational and also other work what is doing. So, for example, health advisory work, because well, people like to also ask questions about their health status from the public health side, and that's one topic that has to go together with the education. I don't know if I just answered the question, but well.
Yeah, I think you're on the same. You're on the same page as Fredrik. One of the things I'm thinking of is, as policymakers, do we need to know how linked up are the agendas, maybe even the budgets of the sport and health ministries? Because how they share those roles and budgets looks like it's going to be a critical question, and that I guess is going to vary from country to country. But I'll go next to Sergio and then to Adam. Sergio, I'm guessing one of the things that you, in your lead position in the International Council for Coaching Excellence, is going to say is, there's always too much on the coach curriculum. You know, you've got to make tough decisions about what gets introduced at what stage of coaching excellence and so on. At what stage do you bring in anti-doping education in recreational sport?
That's a fantastic question, of course. Look, I mean, it is a difficult question. I do believe, though, that the earlier the better. I think, and what might be then is a question of leveling as coaches progress through different coaching qualifications. but an initial awareness raising exercise should probably be done from the first time they take a coaching qualification. And this might be initially just a 20-minute talk, okay? But I think this is something that has to be put in coaches' minds from a very early time, because they really need to acknowledge the role they play in influencing the environment. And as we know from the research that people like Adam and Laurie have done, the attitudes that you create as a coach can go a long way in protecting athletes or recreational participants, I guess. So I would say as early as possible, and then just level it up.
I don't know about this because I don't know much about the motivations of people to be coaches. I've only ever done very low-level coaching, but would I be wrong in thinking lots of people think about coaching and starting at this grassroots level, perhaps because they've got children, for example, who are in the age group and they want to help and make sure that the climate around the sport is good. But how many of them have that kind of idea that they're invested into recreational sport, or they're interested in recreational sport because that's where their kid's at? And how would they buy into an education message as opposed to learning more about the rules of the sport, learning more about training, learning more about age and development of their athletes and how much they can pressurize them or not pressurize them, or learning about the psychological aspects of the role of a coach, because that's a hugely multi-dimensional role. Could it really be prioritized?
I believe so. I think you're completely right in your assessment of who these people tend to be, okay, and why they are there in the first place, particularly in youth sport. I do feel that in my experience really as a coach developer as well, it is really on how you actually get across the importance of these things. They definitely, when I teach basketball coaches, which is my sport, they want to learn. When they come to the basketball courses, they want to learn about basketball initially, okay? And that's where I think coach developers have a great role to play. They have to be capable of raising awareness and raising interest, and really do a good selling job in that sense. But I do think that you don't need a sledgehammer to crack a nut. I think you have to start small and raise awareness, and then find ways to develop. So if they're interested initially in just the sport, maybe that's what you want to give them, okay, or that's where you focus the most. But then obviously other areas, the psychology, the anti-doping, they have to come in as early as possible, and just this idea of progressively raising interest and awareness, I think, is important. I don't think we can wait, because my experience personally, when I've done this, or when I do anti-doping and awareness raising talks with the parents of the kids that I coach, is that a lot of the times they have never thought about it, and once you mention it to them, they see the relevance, because they see that there's a lot that they don't know, and they see that anti-doping is not only for someone in the Olympic Games. Okay, anti-doping is something that is for everybody, and I think they realize that pretty quickly, in my humble opinion.
Okay, thanks very much. Before I move along to Adam, let me just divert over to Slido and put forward a question. But Adam, just to give you fair warning, I am coming to you. I'm going to come back on this transitions and the idea of this multi-layered advice that you had in your app there. So we have Stephen Watkins, and if it's the Stephen Watkins I'm thinking of, he's doping control at the Rugby Football Union. Is one of the challenges in recreational sport that we base the information given to the athletes largely on the WADA code, which wasn't written for them? Oh, that's a really precise question. Thank you very much, Stephen. And the obvious person to answer that is to my right, Fredrik, as the NARDO representative on this expert panel. What do you say?
Well, good question, and an obvious one. And I think a key word here is tailor-made programs and also messages, because I think the main goal with anti-doping programs in recreational sport is to create a healthy exercise environment and a safe place to do sports for kids and youth. And that's a bit of a different perspective than for elite sports. So we cannot take the programs designed for the elites and use them on recreational athletes and coaches. They must be tailor-made, and based on the risks and so on in that particular setting.
It looks to me like a number of you have got quite a broad conception of your role into which this easily fits. I'm desperate for somebody to say, that's just not my job. Because there's got to be people who say, how could I possibly do yet one more thing? And if you are one of those people, get on Slido and ask your question. But while we're waiting for that, Adam, two things. The first is those transition points that I think it was Sergio raised earlier. You know, you're never still at any time. You're either in the process of getting to be the best you can or you're on the way down. I guess that the idea of being at the top doesn't last very long. Whatever stage of excellence you're at, whether it's the recreational or the distributional or the absolute excellence. So talk to us a little bit about how education ought to be tailored, if you can, for these people in transitions. I guess you're going to have a story about the transitions upwards and how their needs in terms of education might be very different from the people transitioning out of elite careers and into recreational sport.
Yeah, so I've not mentioned the I Play Clean program that we run, which was funded by the International Olympic Committee, but that was specifically for those who are on these talent pathways. So they're looking to translate or transfer up, I guess, into this elite level of performance, but they're currently on these, what are known as talent pathways, so they're not necessarily elite. But in terms of their education, I think their education needs to start very early. One point that we made, and if you look at the comments from David Howman about how WADA's most significant concern was those young athletes who are on that pathway, because they're the most tempted. They're the ones who are closest to these professional contracts, to the elite level, and they're ultimately the athletes who are most tempted. So I think their education needs to start, right when they're on their pathway. So our program was designed for 14 to 18-year-olds, looking to really kind of expose these athletes to education before they're ultimately, before that they experience these temptations, experience the opportunities, and also before they might make a decision which is, is ill-informed. And that program that we've developed has been used by national governing bodies, including the Rugby Football League here in the United Kingdom. And all of their academy players are receiving the I Play Clean education program that we developed.
Yeah,
I think it's really important, really important.
Sure, I'd like to pull you up there a little bit. Just because I've got the role of devil's advocate. You said, might make a decision that was ill-informed. How do you, as a professor of psychology, make sense of that portion, though we're not sure if it's really worth talking about because we don't know it's big enough yet, who will just, for example, go to the gym and who will think that they are indeed educated users of pharmacologies that sit on WADA's prohibited list? Because we know that population exists. So you've just said we want to be, try helping people not make ill-informed decisions. But I could guess at least one of those people might stand in front of me and say, thank you very much, but I'm quite well informed about the choices I make. I'm cognizant of the harm risks of using this. I'm very careful with what I use. Leave me alone, I'm not affecting anybody else.
Yeah, so I've kind of got experience from that. That's why I participate in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I would say is kind of rife with doping at a competitive level. And all of those people are of that opinion. I'm informed. I'm informed because I've been on websites. I'd say probably they're ill-informed. They've not had the correct information about the decisions they're making. So I think it's really important that athletes are exposed to the correct information, the right educational messages, not these, and not athletes who are exposed to messages on social media, so-called doctors who are giving them advice on taking, steroids or testosterone, for example. Yeah, and I see lots of that.
Yeah, so these are kind of people who believe they're pharmacological experts rather than having any proper warrant for that title.
Yeah, and they give the messages that they are pharmacological experts by the terminology they use, or I've been speaking to 3 doctors who have told me this, when actually the evidence there or the claims they're making is in contrast to the actual scientific evidence. And when you see, I'm talking social media in gyms, and when you hear people actually questioning them, You know, they get very defensive, and it's like, I'm right because I speak to a doctor, or I've read it in a journal, but actually they're not interpreting the information correctly. And I think these coaches or people like this, they're very, very dangerous.
Jukka, I'm going to come to you, but I'm going to stay with Adam for one further extension of that question. So in that population, there's going to be a mixed catalogue of motivations. And from research that some of my students have done, for example, Luke Cox, you might find people who are taking prohibited substances purely for image-enhancing reasons, for aesthetic reasons, wanting to look bigger and so forth, but they also play rugby. That they're not taking it in order to play rugby and be faster, quicker, stronger, or so forth. They might be that kind of, well, really, I'm about being a certain kind of shape, and that's fulfilling my kind of sense of self and self-identity and so forth, but I also play rugby. How would you, as a psychologist, how do you try to target messages for these people in the borderlands?
Targeted messages. Well, I think it's really important that you first of all, you need to consider the why. Is it performance enhancing? Is it image enhancing? Or is it both? And then I guess you're probably looking at the different motivations behind that. So for example, if it's purely for performance based, then you kind of look at them developing different goal orientations, in encouraging things such as fair play, sports personship. So you're looking at, I guess, educating them for different reasons, where we've not really touched upon image enhancing yet, but I guess there'd be completely different motivation for that. So the psychological ways in which you underpin your education would be different.
Okay, thanks very much. Jukka, when we're talking with Sergio, he's talking to and of a very particular audience, the sample or population of coaches. Fredrik, you've got your own population as a NADO. Jukka, your organisations seem to have a more heterogeneous group of connections. So can you tell us a little bit about how you differentiate your educational packages or programs or messages for the different kinds of groups that you're working with?
Absolutely, yes. So, because, well, our target group is really, really wide, and it's not only about the coaches, it's not about the personal trainers, it's not about the wellness coaches, you name it. But, well, we also have the prison officers, healthcare professionals, and many other different target groups. So we are doing the tailoring of the education and e-learning courses, well, as much as it's technically possible, and in that way trying to focus to this different target group, because, well, the interest of this different target groups varies, because, well, some people are more interested in the training and performance and image enhancing drugs, and, well, different motives to use the doping substances and so on. But, well, also what I want to mention is what I'm told about the scientific-based information, how people will reach and how people will find that information, and especially these different target groups that, well, who are these so-called experts. And I think it is really, really difficult, and it really takes time to build the trust with them, so they can trust the scientific and, well, the correct information that is available. But, well, it's not happening in 1 hour, in 1 day. Probably it takes longer time to build the trust, so they can trust the information that, well, we as an organization, well, provide.
Yeah, thanks very much. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to go to Sergio, then to Adam and to Jukka, and I'd like to ask you, give us one headline. If you're going to wave your magic wand to say, well, here's one thing I really would like to do in order to start making progress in this field of education, doping and recreational sport, give us that one headline, and then I'm going to move over to Lawrence, who's got his feet in both camps, as it were, an expert and a member of the technical expert group, to summarise what he's heard today and how he's going to take that forward into the final report of TEG 2. So let me start with Sergio.
For me, it would come from something that Erik mentioned before, and it links with our view on as an organization. We always try to work on a systems-based approach, really. And for me, the biggest headline would be, this is an issue that is not going to be solved by a single organization, whether that's at a country level or international level. But if I look at, we tend to work with countries. Any kind of initiative is always more successful when all the stakeholders around that have an interest in this come together, because some of them will be better placed to design the material, some of them will be better placed to distribute them, some of them will be better placed to actually get down to ground level, some of them will be better placed to evaluate it. So work together. I think that would be my biggest headline.
Thank you very much. Adam, from a psychological perspective, what's the biggest take-home point that you want to get across?
The biggest take-home point for me would be, it's about having a resource that's easy accessible for grassroots coaches that they can understand. And a resource where if next week, for example, I don't know, an under-18s coach suspects an athlete might be doping through things he's heard, he knows where to go and what to do to help that athlete and to help the situation. And I'm not convinced it's there at the moment. That would be for me, would be very, very important.
Yeah, super. Yeah. Jukka, and for you?
For me, it is a cooperation between different countries, different organizations, just get funding and just do the proper evaluation of the learning programs.
Perfect place to invite the summary comment, because it did look like that was the headline from the whole of the Take Two survey. So, Fredrik, over to you.
Well, it's been a lot of good presentations, good points. I hope you can all agree that anti-doping in recreational sport is important and it's here to stay. And we have to make some guidelines on how to do it effective and how we can measure the programs. And that will be the work of Technical Group 2 in the year to come. And I think we have to learn from each other, and well-resourced organizations will have to be in front so that others can learn from them, from their mistakes and successes, to implement good programs.
Well, I did say I'd give you the last word, but in the spirit of democracy, I've seen one on Slido. So if I can just post that one up just before we finish. Again, Professor Andrea Petrozzi, who presented at the last FAIR Forum, I think. There is a plethora of research showing that bodybuilders, recreational athletes, yeah, I think they fall under pretty much most people's definition of a recreational athlete, are quite knowledgeable of drugs to take. Well, to be fair, I think, Andrea, we gave that one a good go, and Professor Adam Nicholls gave us a fairly reasoned account there. Following the research of Liam Monaghan and Luke Cox, who presented a couple of years ago at the FAIR Forum, the people who call themselves these street pharmacists, have dubious claim to the title of being experts. And very often, as we know, they might be people simply with bachelor's degrees, or people even without degrees, just trying to make a bit of money to get them through university, or supply chains out of utterly unregulated places making all sorts of claims. So I think you've opened up another area there for about how misinformation passes as education in doping in recreational sport, and that certainly is a red flag for all of us. But at that point, I'm going to say thanks very much to Sergio, to Adam, to Jukka, and to Fredrik, and we'll move on to our next session. Thank you all very much. Okay, well, one of the things that we tried to establish in the forum for anti-doping in recreational sport several years ago was an attempt to recognize that the Erasmus Mundus program was sponsoring several projects in anti-dopings with different foci, but they appeared to be working in silos, each developing answers to their own set questions and their own agendas. But we thought it would be very helpful to try to look across the different kinds of projects to see what can be learned, because I think one of the things of value today is to see how people in different domains working in anti-doping have a lot to say to others, based on their knowledge, experience, perhaps expertise. So what we've done today is we've invited Professor Lambros Lazuras from the Impact Project to tell us a little bit over the next 15 minutes about the work that he's been completing on behalf of the Erasmus Mundus programme.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Thanks for everyone for the invite. Again, I have to say that last time that you invited me, I was an associate professor. This year, I'm a professor. If you invite me again next year, I might be vice chancellor, who knows? So let me go straight to my presentation. I prepared a short presentation that I'd like to share with you regarding project impact, which I think captures a lot of the things that we discussed today, that I had today. All right, so that's on full screen, I guess, in the studio mode. Yep, that's what I can see. So a few things about me. As I said, I was promoted recently. Next year, maybe vice chancellor. I have extensive research background on the psychological drivers of doping use, right? And if that sounds, impressive, it's not really impressive, because we only tackled since 2008 a very small area of the different risk factors that might lead people to using performance enhancement drugs or image enhancement drugs. At the same time, I'm leading Erasmus Plus Project Impact, which I'm presenting today. Also, I'm leading Project Mindful Muscles, which takes a more positive psychology, more mindfulness-based approach towards the education. That's a different thing. And the impact approach has to do with what you discussed here today, Mike, and what all the members of the panel actually shared. There is a lot of clean sport education around, right? There are a lot of initiatives. And I think that the problem is that they're little islands, so there is fragmented knowledge. There might be duplicate effort as well. So we're not really capturing the most effective ways to generate new solutions, innovation, and at the same time, have innovative solutions that tackle emerging questions, like the ones that you discussed over the last 10, 15 minutes. So what we wanted to do with Impact really was to provide an effective knowledge management framework so that people who work in the field, or those who are interested in the field, from diverse backgrounds, right, like Fredrik having two hats, or people who are like Adam and myself, academics, or Michael, Petrou, practitioners, enable synergies between them and strategic collaboration. And also together with this effort, maximize the visibility and utilization, and subsequently the impact of existing clean sport education initiatives, with a view of innovating them by recreating them to address the different needs at different times. So these are the objectives of Project Impact. We wanted to develop the first formal communities of practice for clean sport education across different European countries, enable the synergies that I just mentioned, and at the same time, increase awareness about the benefits of using this approach, the communities of practice, to support and further promote and innovate in the area of clean sport education. So we did really two things. One is that we supported and we empowered local communities of practice in the different countries that were participating in the project, and there were 6 countries. So the goal was to create 6 communities of practice, 1 in each country, but now we have more than 9, really, and I will very briefly present some of them later on. There has been a great interest from the community, from the sport stakeholders, from anti-doping practitioners to come together, share knowledge and ideas, and try to identify the best practices and utilize those practices so that they can effectively tackle the local or regional needs when it comes to doping, may that be recreational, elite sport, or both, or the gray areas, as you mentioned before. Now, the other thing that we did, and I will briefly present later, is that we created a kind of a search engine, an international repository of clean sport education. So we went out and we talked with people who have received funding from WADA, Erasmus Plus Sport, International Olympics Committee, those who have developed a web-based clean sport education resource, right? And we put everything together. And of course, this is an ongoing task. And I'd like to invite anyone in the panel today or in the audience who have developed such web-based education to share this information if they want with us, because we're offering this kind of one-stop shop where people can find access to this information. And the focus here is both elite professional competitive sport as well as amateur recreational and grassroots sport. And we're tackling different areas. These are just indicative areas Of course, there might be crossovers across the different areas that are presented. So we might tackle issues from nutritional supplement use and doping. Is it a gateway or not? Up to whistleblowing and promoting policies and education to support whistleblowing in athletes and their support personnel. This is the impact partnership, but this is the core impact partnership. Throughout the communities of practice, we engaged with local stakeholders in different countries, even beyond the consortium of the project and even beyond Europe. So we're growing actually the informal partnership that we have for this project. Now, some picture before the pandemic, that's why nobody's wearing masks, because that project started in 2018, 2019, and up to March 2020, we were meeting with people and we were not wearing any kind of face coverings. Then we turned online, as you can see here. And this is a picture from a community of practice that was developed in Cyprus with a joint collaboration of practitioners, Cyprus Anti-Doping Authority, and an academic institution, University of Nicosia. So what happened there is that they wanted to tackle doping in university sport, and there was no such thing in the country before really introducing this community of practice. Now, through the workings of the community of practice, other issues emerged. So how do we more effectively tackle doping in a small community like Cyprus, right? What are the gray areas that need to be tackled? So this is a lively thing. It engages students, undergraduate and postgraduate students from such areas like biology, sports nutrition, psychology, even medicine, and they came together, exchanged ideas how to tackle doping in university sport and how to also engage more actively in the anti-doping fight when they become professionals. Most of them were graduates at the time, so that was a very timely point for them to see how they can integrate anti-doping initiatives and education within their practice and within their continuous professional development. These are some of the testimonies that they shared with us. So clearly, they were happy, they saw benefits, and joining this community of practice and participating in the community of practice was something that really benefited them in many ways. I have to say here that those communities of practice, they are an organic structure. So this is a bottom-up thing. We don't go and impose things on how to do it. We don't go and impose to people on how they meet and what goals they set. Rather, we provide the framework. We tell them how a community of practice operates. And then once we give them this kind of manual information, how to, then they start by setting their own goals and objectives, address their own local needs, and then they work together. They meet 3, 4, 5 times or more, depending on the needs, and they engage in different tasks so that they can address the goals that they've set in the very first meeting of their community. In Italy, we focused a lot on recreational and competitive cycling with Lazio Ciclismo, and they've done tremendous work there, working also with sport journalists on how doping education, not just doping prevalence or doping scandals, but doping education and clean sport values are widely disseminated through the media, so that gradually social norms are created that they can support clean sport education. Now, there's another thing that we tried to do, and it works really well so far. We have an international community of practice. This is in collaboration with Cyprus Anti-Doping Authority and colleagues and MMA fighters, competitive MMA fighters from the UK and other countries. We work closely with competitive athletes in this sport because we realize that within the sport, and it's not the only sport where this happens, as Adam said before, and as you also mentioned, Mike, there might be supposedly experts, people who really don't know anything or are ill-informed, and they try to disseminate maybe harmful information, like if you take this drug in combination with the other, then this is what you do. So we're talking more about snake oil merchants, and we try to eradicate this. We try to identify what are the training needs, what are the challenges, what are the temptation of MMA fighters when it comes to doping, and through that, identify which might be the best ways to educate this target population. As I said, again, a bottom-up approach. We engage with them, we talk with them, we listen to what they have to say, and we come to solutions jointly. Now, this is another community of practice, which is part of my other project, Mindful Muscles. So gradually, it's the legacy of impact into other Erasmus Plus projects, and we try to inspire tomorrow's experts. So what we do here is we have early career researchers PhD researchers or early career postdoc researchers from different countries. Mostly they come from the UK, European Union, but also we have potential candidates from Australia as well. What we're trying to do is bring together the minds of tomorrow. So they all work in different disciplines. They all have a vested interest in iPad research, right, and doping more generally. And we try to help them, one, create new knowledge, to identify emerging trends and emerging challenges and questions, and we support them actively to apply for their own research funding. So the senior experts, the senior academic experts in the group, all we do is that we provide mentoring and pastoral support to the early career researchers so that they can spread their wings and fly, right, and generate new knowledge and innovation in this area. At the same time, and this is the latest development in our communities of practice, we try to achieve what you mentioned before, which has to do actually with the employability skills of people working in sport, right, in different sport-related jobs, or even in health education and health promotion, like Jukka from Finland. So what we're trying to do here is see how we can embed clean sport education within the curriculum, let's say of professional colleges like we have in the UK. So we're in collaboration with Barnsley College, which is a local college in Yorkshire, and we will have a meeting in 2 weeks where we discuss with the curriculum development leaders how they can incorporate clean sport education so that their graduate in physical education, in coaching, in fitness training, and personal training, they have at least the basic knowledge around doping and around clean sport issues. Of course, as I said, this is a starting point. We'd like to see this growing, but I think that this is essentially the main thing that Impact is trying to achieve. We want to inspire people to deal with it, to deal with clean sport education. And I'm turning to the clean sport education repository. As I said, this is more like a repository where you can find information, anti-doping education projects, web-based ones, wide range of projects there, and I will show some of them to you. And I think that what's interesting here, especially for anti-doping practitioners and NADOs, is that those projects, they have been mapped against the IEC criteria, the World International Standard for Education criteria. So whenever you click on one of the projects that's shown in this repository, you know which components and which specific topics of the IEC are covered. And that might help anti-doping organizations, so sport governing bodies, to see whether those programs are relevant to them. This is an example of such a program, Project Whistle. It was funded by Erasmus Plus a few years ago. It provides lectures, PowerPoint notes, and workshop material about how to do a discussion with coaches and athletes around whistleblowing. We have another project here. Adam mentioned that. That's Adam's project, actually, I Play Clean, that was funded by the IOC. So this project has a series of videos where especially younger athletes can watch and they can engage in classroom discussion around doping. So it doesn't really capture only elite competitive sport. It also has to do with recreational, especially in the younger ages. That's a project that was jointly developed by the great minds of doping at the time, including Andrea Petrozzi, Vasilis Barkoukis, Arnaldo Zelli from Italy, and a lot of other people. That was supported for 4 years, and it was awarded a success story prize from the European Commission. That's still on, funded by WADA currently, where we try to establish the effectiveness within the context of elite competitive sport. And that's project advice that Adam mentioned before. So I don't want to reiterate the information about the projects. All I want to show you is that if you log in, if you open this repository of Project Impact, you will find all this information. And as I said before, I invite everyone who has developed such projects to let us know if they want their project to be posted there, to be included in our repository. I think that it will greatly help people from the field. We presented this repository to more than 13 others last month, and they all displayed an interest to start using it and see how they can use the different resources there. And those resources are available in different languages. So just to save you time from asking this later, Mike, what is the key take-home message from Impact? I think there is only one key message here, and that comes also from a song from Can't Hit, for those of you who are old enough to remember them. Let's walk together. and by together, create synergies and tackle emerging questions in clean sport education and the challenges that lie ahead. Thank you. This is the where the URL of the address of our project. It used to be projectimpact.eu, but this guy had different plans, so we had to host it in a European country, and that was ALF, Aristotle University. That's why we have alf.gr in the suffix. That's it, and thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lambros Lazuras. I think you've just given just a great testimony to why it's important that the forum looks outside of itself, looks across the broader categories, because you've really sort of given good solutions to a number of issues that were raised here. And that key one in the last session about access to resources, well, the repository looks like a fantastic resource there. So congratulations to you and to all the partners that you've worked with in the various projects, and thanks very much for enriching the FAIR Forum today. Before I come to a close for everybody, can I draw your attention please to Slido just one last time, because in the spirit of the last TEG group, we have to do our evaluation. And so we just put up a very short evaluation on the forum. I'd be delighted if you would please respond to that. That would be very helpful for us. But can I, on behalf of Cliff Collins, the Programs Director here at Europe Active, my colleagues in TEG 1 and TEG 2 of the FAIR Plus project, thank you all for attending. Thanks to your questions. Thank you especially to all the presenters and the researchers across the various projects. I do think this sphere of doping in recreational sport is developing its own identity. I think there was a period in the early part where we were really looking at what's happening in elite sport and how can we sort of deduce what to do in the recreational field. But it looks like now data, evidence, ideas, possibly theories are coming from the field itself as to how it should develop. And the Erasmus programme has been central to driving research to foster that development. So thank you all for coming. We very much look forward to seeing you next November at the next forum around about the same time. And I wish you well for the coming period. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.